hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're here to have a conversation about achieving growth and security in the Northern Triangle of Central America. We're releasing a report today. The report was supported by the Smith Richardson Foundation, and I want to thank a couple of people, and then I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. I want to first thank Aaron Neeler, who is one of the contributing authors of the report, and then I want to really effusively thank Christina Perkins, who is the principal author of the report and traveled to all three of the countries, as well as to Colombia and Mexico over the last year, and has worked extremely hard on the report. And so I think we've got, some really interesting points to make, and we want to, I think one of the key points is that if we want to deal with some of the root challenges or the root causes of some of the challenges in Central America, that the United States has a role to play, but it's going to require an extended period of time. The other point is that we need to bring in the formal private sector. We need to have formal private sector growth, and we need to encourage that the best social program is a job. Those are some points to take away from this. I'm so grateful that Senator Tim Kaine has agreed to be our keynote speaker. I'm a constituent too, Senator. I want you to know that. And Senator Tim Kaine was elected to the Senate in 2012 after serving as mayor of Richmond from 1998 to 2001 and governor of Virginia from 2006 to 2010. He serves on the Armed Services, Budget, Foreign Relations, and Aging Committees. On the Foreign Relations Committee, he focuses on Middle East and Latin America. I testified before the senator about 3 or 4 months ago, and as soon as I started talking about Central America, he lit up. And he asked a lot of hard questions. I got follow-up questions, and I got homework assignments. And so he's very, very committed to Central America. And I'm quite envious because his Spanish is better than mine, and he really just speaks really beautiful Spanish. And the reason he speaks such beautiful Spanish is he was a volunteer in Honduras, and I know it changed his life. And so I'm just so grateful that Senator Kaine would be here. And please, Senator Kaine, come on up and say some remarks. Thank you very much. Please give him a warm welcome.
Hey, good morning. Thank you. What a great group. I love being with people in Washington who are passionate about the Americas, because we're a tiny little group, but we're mighty. This is a city whose focus on international relations, I always say on my foreign relations committee, we kind of have an east-west axis. We have a lot of people who care deeply about Europe, about Russia, about China, about the Middle East, about Japan, and you can go back in history about the Soviet Union before. There's been an east-west axis to American foreign policy that has been dominant. But as the report indicates, and I've had a chance to read the report quickly, and I'm going to go back and really pay attention to it, our attention in the Americas, and especially in the Central American region, is very episodic. It tends to be a crisis-driven attention rather than a persistent attention. And sometimes even when the United States has had a foreign policy doctrine about the Americas, it's not really been about the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was a policy about the Americas, but it was really a policy about Europe. It was telling Europe, we want you to stay out of the Americas. And much of the Cold War activity of the United States in the Americas, it might have been activity in the Americas, but it was really a policy about the Soviet Union, not about the Americas. And so any group, and CSIS has such a great track record on so many things, that says we're going to try to illuminate, elevate, shine a spotlight on issues in the Americas is close to my heart for the reasons that Dan said. So I'm very, very happy to be here, and happy that this report is out and that we can use its wisdom to help guide us in work we do in Congress. I was a first-year student at law school at Harvard in the fall of 1979, and decided that I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and everybody around me was very sure of themselves. Now, I learned later they were just better actors than me. They were no more sure than I was. But I decided in the middle of my first year at Harvard to take a year off and go work with Jesuit missionaries in a town called El Progreso, Honduras, which is very near San Pedro Sula. And San Pedro in the north of Honduras has really been the epicenter of the unaccompanied minor challenge from that country. I wrote to the missionaries who I had some connection with through my high school. I said, let me come and be a volunteer so I can figure out my life. And I went and became, for an academic year, the principal of a school, the Instituto Técnico Loyola, which is a school that taught kids to be welders and carpenters that still exists today. It's grown very greatly, and my wife and I have been supporters of it for years. It was a very, very difficult time in Honduras. It was a military dictatorship. General Policarpo Paz was the leader of the country. There was promises of elections someday in the future, but the military had seized power. That was what was going on in Honduras. There were civil wars that were roiling El Salvador and Guatemala, the Northern Triangle near San Pedro, near those other countries, and so refugees from both Guatemala and Salvador were pouring across the border. The United States at that point, I was there basically 80, 81, decided to use southern Honduras as a staging ground for activities to try to topple the government in Nicaragua. And so you had internal challenges of a military dictatorship in Honduras, a lot of intrigue surrounding the use of Honduras as a military base to go and battle Nicaragua. You had these civil wars in Salvador and Guatemala. Shortly before I arrived, Oscar Romero was assassinated in El Salvador. When I was in Honduras, the 4 American nuns were killed in El Salvador. Priests that I worked with and knew were killed. One was killed by the Honduran military a few years after I left, and some of the priests that I knew were killed in 1989 in the murder of Jesuit priests at the University of Central America in San Salvador. So it was a very, very difficult, frightening time, and I was a naive Midwestern kid who kind of blithely wandered into it, without thinking too much about it. But it was an experience that changed my life. My wife and I have stayed in connection with the Jesuits of El Progreso, Honduras for many, many years, and that's why I'm so passionate about it. When I came to the Senate in 2013, I made my pitch about committees, and I asked to be on the Armed Services Committee because there's always a Virginian in Armed Services, and that was important. And Harry Reid said, yeah, you can be on Armed Services. I asked to be on Foreign Relations. He said, we don't put people on Armed Services and Foreign Relations. We just don't do that. And I said, let me make a pitch to you. I'm fluent in Spanish. I can go on TV and radio and talk in a language that 45 million Americans use to get their news about everything, and you only have 2 others in the Senate who are. Why don't you put me on the committee and let me do work in the Americas since people aren't really focused on it? And that's how I got to be on the Foreign Relations Committee, and I've made my area of specialty, as Dan said, the Middle East and Latin America. Here is a tragic observation. I told you at some length about the dangerous nature of Honduras when I lived there, even including people that I worked with. I came to the conclusion over the years, and then this has been deepened when I came onto the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, that as bad as it was then with civil wars and a military dictatorship, and even people that I knew being targeted and some even being killed, now that we were in a democracy and there were elections, it was worse. I have a naive faith that political improvement and the move from dictatorship to democracy will mean an overall improvement. And yet, the lives of the people that I knew in many ways were much worse. I had been to Honduras in 2004 to visit a number of the Jesuits, and just the conditions of the priests who I had known in 1980 to now, the neighborhood they lived in, the challenges in the neighborhood they lived in had grown more intense. And that caused me to do a lot of soul searching about what is the nature of progress. Will political progress moving from authoritarian to democracy, is it really progress or not? And I think that that's a question that we all have to grapple with. But you know the challenges now, and this report is written to offer ways that the United States can be a stable partner in addressing the challenges. By the summer of 2014, the inattention paid to the region was kind of ripped away in one of these episodic moments because of the growth in the number of unaccompanied children from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador especially, who were making that very perilous path through Mexico to come to the United States. And there was a great deal of, angst and concern about it. In fact, the Congress tried to take up an amendment to a statute that was called the William Wilberforce Act. It's really interesting. It was a statute that was passed that was meant to provide protection for refugees. It was named after an English religious leader who was one of the key voices against slavery. So it was a humanitarian pro-refugee bill, but there was an effort in the summer of 2014 to go into the Wilberforce Act to make it tougher on these young kids who are coming to the United States. There's a lot of reasons the kids come to the United States. And when they started to come in increasing numbers, they've been coming every year, but when the numbers started to grow, there was a lot of concern and anxiety in Congress and in the American public about it. And I took the floor and I gave a Senate speech about it, and I said, look, this is not a problem we're unconnected with. You know, I would hope that we might feel some sense of humanitarian responsibility because we're a humanitarian nation. I would hope that. But let me take it one step further. Why are children fleeing to the United States? They're not fleeing because they want to leave their homes. They're not fleeing because their parents want them to leave their homes. No country wants to export its youth. Nobody wants to export their youth. The youth are the future. They're coming because their neighborhoods are so violent and the opportunities are so few. And when it comes to violence, the violence has a cause. It has a cause, and it's largely the cause of the drug trade. And the root of that cause is the intense demand for illegal drugs that American consumers put out into the marketplace. There is such a demand for illegal drugs in this country that we send cash south to bring drugs north. And a country like Honduras, as a transit point, gets flooded with an illicit cash economy that corrupts virtually every institution that they have. In a poor country whose measures of poverty across virtually every specter are significant, being a transit point for drugs that aren't drugs that are used really by Hondurans. It's not Honduran demand for drugs that has turned the country into a violent zone. It's that Honduras is a transit point for drugs coming to feed this illicit demand in the United States. So it's our cash that is basically in many of these countries leading to gangs willing to battle each other because they're trying to get cash. It's our cash in many of these countries that are leading to the corruption of institutions or contributing to the corruption of institutions. There's a lot of blame to go around. There's a lot of fault within these countries. There's a lot of things that if they don't do, there's nothing we can do that will help them solve it. But we have a connection to this violence epidemic that is causing youngsters to come to this country. And that gives us a responsibility, not just because we want to reduce the number of unaccompanied minors, but I mean, we've got a connection. We've got a partial culpability for the social and security challenges that are ravaging these nations. So I spoke out against this effort to take a humanitarian refugee bill and make it harsher against these kids, kind of blaming them and the countries for the problems. And since that time, have tried to work very hard with the nations in Central America on the kinds of solutions that this report recognizes. This report talks about a whole series of issues, about the need to broaden the tax base, about the compelling need to develop better relations between the government sector and the private sector, not only within each nation, but sort of among the three nations, and the need to take anti-corruption efforts seriously. There's efforts in each country. The report goes into it, but there's a real need to scale it up. But the U.S. has got to have a role. The report does a very good job of, in a chapter, talking about Colombia. And as people who care deeply about the Americas, I think we all are mindful of Colombia as an example of a state that was, a failed state, and that we viewed, as just the word Colombia brought to mind an image of hyperviolence and drugs in a failed state, and yet the amazing persistence of the Colombian people and the commitment to end 50 years of civil war and violence, and the courage of some elected leaders there who have been willing to do very, very difficult things, and a persistent partnership by the United States, beginning with the Clinton administration, through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration. A persistent partnership has dramatically affected and improved Colombian life. And I know you know this so very, very well, and we also all know we're not at the end. As the president of Colombia always says, finishing the war is not the same thing as winning the peace. There are huge parts of the country that have been systematically disinvested in over years because of violence, and there's just not a public service infrastructure in some parts of the country. As a result, this is not going to be easy, and that's why President Obama said, okay, now the U.S. needs to go from Plan Colombia to Paz Colombia to continue to be investors in the Colombia. But I can't tell you how amazing it is to me when I travel around the world, knowing where Colombia was, and I go to the Sinai, for example, And I'm interacting with the multinational force of observers in the Sinai that since the late 70s have been protecting the border between Egypt and Israel. And I see Colombian military as part of that peacekeeping force. Colombia has not only improved internally, they have a sense of confidence and pride about sharing their own story and about offering their own expertise to peacekeeping missions around the world, which is a really interesting bellwether or example, or bit of evidence about the progress they've made. So this report uses the Colombia example to talk about what we need to do with the Northern Triangle, and I think that that's a very apt example. I'll tell you a story. We put about $560 million into Central America, I think, in 2015. And then the president came in FY16, and made a request in the budget for $1 billion for this Alliance for Progress in the three nations. That's a big lift. You know, we are, as you're going to see, as you've been watching, and as you're going to see as we're dealing with the continuing resolution this week, and as we're going to deal with budgetary politics going forward, requests to significantly increase any line item in the federal budget in the age of sequester and austerity is pretty difficult. When the president made that request, I asked Senator John Cornyn of Texas, and I get along real well with John. I said, let's go to Central America together because the president's made this request for $1 billion. And that could be a heavy lift, maybe especially from some folks on your side of the aisle, but you're a senator from Texas, you know these challenges. Let's go together to the Northern Triangle and talk with officials there. And we set up a trip, and he traded me. He said, I'll go with you to Central America if you go with me to Mexico to talk about energy reform. I said, you got a deal. So we went to Mexico, and we went to Honduras, and we went to Colombia as well to explore the example a little bit and try to figure out its application to the Central American situation. And it was a really powerful visit. Senator Cornyn is somebody who, you know, he and I differ on a whole lot of policy issues, but the unaccompanied minor issue, a belief that the U.S. has some responsibility, this was a very important point of common accord. And after that trip, we came back and we both went to work to make sure that the president's proposed investment, that we could get it and make that investment in Central America. That year, the Senate put $750 million, not the full billion. You just don't get everything you ask for around here, but we put $750 million into the appropriations bill for Central America. The House put in zero. So it was 750 and it was zero. But because of Senator Cornyn and others, we were able in conference to not split the difference. In conference, it came out at 750. And so up to 750, and so that first 560 in the previous year, 750, and now we have more work to do going forward. If we're going to make it work, though, we have to approach it on our standpoint like we approached Plan Colombia. We're going to have to approach it over a multi-year period, and we're going to have to be demanding. Now we'll get to the recommendations for the three nations. There's what we can do. We're going to have to be demanding of the three nations, that they take anti-corruption seriously, that they continue to push to reduce violence. The homicide rates in all three of the nations are coming down, but there's a longer way to go. And I know the Honduran reality better than Salvador and Guatemala just because of my connections there. Murder of journalists, murder of environmental activists. There continue to be high-profile crimes for which there's often no accountability, at least in the near term. There may be efforts to find people and hold them accountable for high-profile crimes like the murder of Berta Cáceres and the murder of journalists. But there's an awful lot to do. So these nations, with our help, will tackle the security challenges. The nations recently convened, I think it was on the 15th of November, a three-nation kind of a multi-jurisdictional anti-crime effort where they are trying to, stop people from just moving across borders to seek, haven. And recently, the Salvadoran government was able to work together well with the Guatemalan government to arrest some folks who had fled over the border into Guatemala. There was some good cooperation in that. So the anti-crime efforts are important. The anti-corruption efforts are important. Strengthening the relations between the three countries and between the private sector and their governments, very, very important. We've just got to keep pressure on. Reports like this are great because they put out on the table a set of strategies and metrics. Dan has testified before us, and I'll say Senator Corker, the chair of our committee, has been an ally in this too. When we put the $750 million in, I said to Senator Corker, Now let's have hearings about how we're using it and what metrics we expect out of it. And it's good for us to get state and USAID before us and kind of pepper them with questions about what is it that we expect to see. And if you're going to ask in a future budget for more, what should we be examining to determine whether the investments are moving us down the path towards success. So you'll see, I think, under the current leadership in the Foreign Relations Committee, a continued interest in the topic, not just episodic, that will largely manifest itself around trying to exercise appropriate oversight about whether the dollars we're investing are dollars that are producing value. There is also, I know that there are folks here from nations other than the Northern Triangle. I visited with the Costa Rican ambassador to the United States. There's also a tremendous role for partners in the region. Mexico is being helpful on some of these efforts. Costa Rica is being helpful on these efforts. Colombia is being helpful in these efforts. And so there's a role for the United States, and there's a role for institutions like the OAS, which has been part of the anti-corruption effort in Honduras, and Transparency International. International NGOs are coming in to help out too. But the focus of this report is the broad context of the challenges, but it's also this narrow and important role about how do we shake ourselves out of our episodic attention or inattention to the region and have a consistent policy that will improve the quality of life for people, and in doing that will also benefit the American economy and the American security. I think we're in a, last thing I'll say, and then you have a panel to follow me, and I'm running back up to the Hill. I think we're in a remarkable moment in the Americas. The peace deal, which, though rejected in referendum, the ceasefire has largely held in Colombia. It marks the end of war in the two continents, North America and South America. There's no war now in these two continents for the first time in recorded human history. And no other continent can say that today. There's war in Europe. I have a boy deployed there right now. There's war in Africa. There's war in Asia. There's war in the Middle East. The Americas has all kinds of challenges. We're human. But to have finished the last thing that would be a major war and to have a period of some peace and stability in the 37 nations, in the 1+ billion people, it's pretty remarkable. And again, we can focus our attention east-west and neglect the opportunity to really take advantage, shine a spotlight on, and elevate the profile of the work that we're doing. And I think it's really an important time to focus on the Americas because of trends in the Americas, because of the fact that we all call ourselves American. I think Amerigo Vespucci was one of the overachievers of all time to get 2 continents named after him. But we all call ourselves Americans. We all use the same label to describe ourselves. 45 million citizens of this country have raíces in Las Americas, and if you have roots somewhere, you're always going to care about it. And so we're connected by culture, by experience, by language. Spanish was spoken in the United States earlier than English, and it has been continuously spoken here longer than English. So we're in what I would call kind of a Hispanic moment in the United States, and that ought to be an additional motivation for us to end the episodic inattention and be a little more persistent and a little more thoughtful and a little more intentional. And that's what this report will help us do. Sure, about the 3 countries in the Northern Triangle, but it's really, I think, part of a broader effort for us to have a more thoughtful and continuous focus on our own hemisphere. So thank you at CSAS for doing this. Thanks for having me come and offer some thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you up on the Hill. Appreciate it.
Oh, my word. That was just tremendous. Could I ask you all to give Senator Kaine another round of applause? That was just phenomenal. Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you very, very much. That was really thoughtful and heartfelt. Thank you very much for investing your time. I know you're really busy. Thank you, Senator. And I also want to tell you, you have a great staff who support you. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you. Okay, we've got 2 really good panels, and I really want you to stay for both. we made a big effort to make sure that the second panel, we wanted to have voices from each of the three countries. And so we had people really vote with their feet to come and take the time to be with us from the region. So we have a panel that's going to be moderated. The first panel is going to be moderated by my friend Kim Breyer, who's the director of the Mexico program, from folks within the U.S. government and also folks who in government or formerly in government, to talk about the region from from an outsider's perspective, if you will, and what we can do to contribute and what contributions we can make. But then I think we're really fortunate to have some really thoughtful, engaged people who've invested the time to be with us from the Northern Triangle, and it's really important to have their voices. So I'm going to ask my friend Kim and the panelists to come on up, and we'll get started. Thank you very much. Kim, come on up. Kim runs is the director of our Mexico program and part of our Americas program, and is a friend and colleague. I really appreciate you being here, Kim. Come on up.
Ask our panel to come on up as well, if you wouldn't mind, and grab a seat. I apologize, I got into one of the waters early. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I couldn't ask for a better introduction than what we just heard from Senator Kaine. The mission statement of our New Americas program here at CSIS is to elevate the dialogue on the Americas to the strategic level, because Michael Matera, the Americas Director, and I are true believers in the relationship with the Americas and have spent the bulk of our lives working on these issues, and we couldn't be happier today to be here as part of Dan's program. I'm honored to preside over the U.S. policy portion of our panel this morning on perspective on the Alliance for Prosperity, the plan, as we've discussed, which is focused on security and economic development in the three countries of the Northern Triangle: El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. I want to congratulate Dan Rundy and his team in the Project on Prosperity and Development here at CSIS for the excellent work they've done in preparing the report, which I hope you grabbed a hard copy of out front, which is also available on our website. I really want to congratulate them for offering what I think are quite bold recommendations for future policy in the Northern Triangle. And I think Dan and his team also must be commended for having impeccable timing in the release of their report. I think it's an important moment, and this is an important time for us to be talking about this. When we look at U.S. policy over the past 8 to 10 years in the Americas, several programs stand out. Senator Kaine mentioned one of them, Plan Colombia. And of course, the Merida initiative working with Mexico, and most recently, the Alliance for Prosperity. And I think it's important to highlight that all three of these programs are bipartisan supported programs that share a common understanding that some of the challenges that we face in the United States must be met at their roots, and that working closely with local governments is the best pathway toward achieving our goals. The Alliance for Prosperity actually stands out in my mind for being one of the most forward-leaning of the programs, and also for being ambitious. Plan Colombia, as you know, is focused on one country, as is most of the Merida initiative. This is focused on three countries, so there's an added level of complexity with the Alliance for Prosperity that I think we should not underestimate. I don't think we could have a better panel assembled today to discuss the evolution of policy in the Northern Triangle. Our panelists have decades of experience in development issues, U.S. assistance policy, and in the Northern Triangle specifically. First, I want to introduce Marcela Escobari, who is the Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. Marcela came to the U.S. government after nearly a decade of experience at Harvard University, and was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, a title I think all of us would like to hold, particularly the young part.
For longevity.
Mark Lopez is the Executive Director for the United States at the Inter-American Development Bank. The IDB, as you know, is one of the key players in the implementation of the Alliance for Prosperity, and really a force multiplier for the policy. So we're thrilled to have Mark here. He comes from a really interesting background of having worked on the Hill as a senior foreign policy advisor on development for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, among many other Hill positions. Also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, and has a degree from the Berklee College of Music, which is very interesting in addition to Harvard's Kennedy School. And we're also pleased to have Ambassador James Michael here, who's the former U.S. ambassador to Guatemala and, of course, an esteemed advisor to CSIS. He's currently an independent consultant and has a long and distinguished career in government in the OECD, including serving as the assistant administrator for USAID during his government years. Before I turn to Marcela, who I think is going to kick us off this morning, I wanted to give you a quick couple of admin notes. We've asked each panelist to speak for roughly 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will use or abuse the authority of the chair to ask a few questions, and then we will open it to questions from the audience. So many thanks, everyone, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Where's the little stool, Dan, for young but short people? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kimberly and CSIS and Dan Rundy, and for convening this panel, but also for this great report that you launched. I'm honored to be here with Ambassador Michael, with Mark Lopez, two people who have spent much of their career fostering a positive U.S. engagement with the region. So I think it's an important time for Central America, and I see that there are three forces that are combining that create a momentum right now that we shouldn't waste. One, this issue that has been brought up before, that there's a bipartisan effort and support for this policy, and one that has decided to focus on the root causes of this migration crisis. And this is something not to be taken for granted, but I think focusing on the root causes is a smart thing to do, and it's the right thing to do. Second, that we have seen, despite many challenges, real political will from each of these three Northern Triangle governments to really push difficult reforms. And lastly, that we've also seen, in terms of USAID, the early results and wins of programs that are working. And we have a much better grasp of what works and what doesn't in the region. So I think it's important that we don't waste this momentum on these three fronts at a time that there's great uncertainty in the development community. Because success both on migration and on development will require staying power and a continued commitment from the US government. So on root causes, as many of you know, the programs that we run in Central America received a significant ramp up. Senator Kaine discussed this. As our funding doubled in the last 2 years. And this was due to, in response to the migration crisis, an increased flow of unaccompanied children in 2014, where over 52,000 unaccompanied minors were intercepted in the US border. And this drew attention from the American people, from Congress, and from the Northern Triangle governments. And the crisis also served as a wake-up call that crime and violence in the region had reached unprecedented levels, that people were willing to risk their lives in this treacherous path to reach our southern border, and they were even willing to let their children do this journey alone, better than to face intimidation, extortion, and murder in many of their communities. So the U.S. engagement in Central America, the U.S. strategy, was based on attacking these root causes of this increase in migration flow, with a focus on prosperity, government, and citizen security. In Guatemala, it was mostly because of a lack of jobs. In Honduras and El Salvador is a mixture of lack of opportunity and also the incredible rise in violence. At some point, El Salvador had over 100 homicides per 100,000, and this was larger than any other country that was not an active war zone. So approaching this crisis through the push factors and focusing on root causes is not something that we can take for granted. It required, as Senator Kaine mentioned, like the very purposeful push from people in this panel, and I know that Mark was probably relentless in the Hill pushing this strategy, as well as the Vice President and the President, that we shouldn't focus on this crisis solely at the border. Because managing the border, through enforcement, through detention centers, providing due process, is extremely expensive. right? DHS has budgets for over $20 billion to deal with border control. And even when there are changes in this flow of migration that are above what's expected, it means billions in extra expenses, right? A bet or an investment of $750 million to tackle root causes is definitely the right investment and the cheap one. And it's also the only sustainable way. When you look at trends in migration from Mexico, there's research from Michael Clemens at CGDs that shows that the migration trends in Mexico had a lot more to do with the demographics on the two countries, how many young people were there, how many young people were here, and the jobs available, than our efforts in law enforcement and border control. And there's also studies that show how the violence and perception of violence influence people's interest in migrating. So unless we create opportunities that really deal with this wage differential between the two countries and the perceptions of violence, these flows are going to continue to increase. Second momentum that I mentioned is this issue of commitment from the Northern Triangle countries. And there's a lot of challenges that still exist in the region. But I do think we have to take heart with some of the gains, right? The governments in the Northern Triangle are committing $2.6 billion to this effort. So it's $4 for every dollar that we're putting in. El Salvador implemented a tax reform, taxing security tax on telecom and wealthy Salvadorians, that is bound to bring around $140 million a year. The Honduran government has made progress on professionalizing and cleaning up its policing, having purged over 300 high-level officials from its police ranks. You know, you have seen the strength and the independence of the attorney generals in each of the three countries. Recently in El Salvador, the former attorney general, 2 presidents have been implicated in a corruption scandal. You know, CICIG's mandate has been extended. As you remember, it sent shockwaves through Guatemalan society, showing that even the president is not above the law. Tax collection in El Salvador has increased from 12% to 16%, which does not seem earth-shattering, but it's big progress in given the record in many of these countries. The IDB is helping right now kind of garner the private sector to invest in public goods. And I could go on, but I think we should take note on this commitment on accountability and transparency in many of these countries that often many of these governments have to pay a price domestically for these reforms. And we've also seen early results on our programs, on things that are working, on violence and homicide reduction. We're working, USAID with INL is working in some of the most dangerous areas. And to be honest, in issues of crime reduction and dealing with gangs, there's not a lot of literature out there of what works. There's been a lot of experimentation and testing things that have started to yield really positive results. I traveled through the region and I went to Riviera Hernandez, which is probably one of the most violent neighborhoods in San Pedro de Sula. Even Coke trucks do not dare enter there. And you know that if Coca-Cola doesn't arrive, it's bad news. And the work that we're doing there with the community, with police reform, on training the police on community policing, youth centers, training, employment, all of this integrated place-based strategy has had a tremendous effect. I mean, I think murders went from 194 in 2013 to 74 in 2015, which is a huge decrease. Still, we're talking about 74 murders in a neighborhood. Our programs to increase productivity in the dry corridor and create trade opportunities for some of the staple crops there have led to increases in incomes of 50% in some of these places. And I hope to get a chance to talk a little bit more about our work on creating jobs with SMEs and whatnot. So the results are in, and we're hoping to double down on some of the things that work and also expand our programming. But lastly, and this is something that I think is going to be a theme throughout this morning, is that we need to be here for the long run. I mean, USAID has been in Central America since its inception in 1961. And our support has waxed and waned in response to different crises. And most recently, our budgets were significantly decreased due to other global issues taking priority. And now we've had another surge as a response to this crisis. The ups and downs on funding can be detrimental to long-term development because our aid becomes a function of large projects that come and go, leaving big institutional vacuums. So real results will come from shoring up local institutions, from sometimes shifting the structures of the economy to more complex products, even changing social norms. None of these are short-term goals. So all of these require this long-term road and having countries themselves lead this process. So if we take this approach, I think we will not only see a decrease in the increased outflows in migration, but we'll avert a lot more serious threats to our national security and stability of the region. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Marcela. Great to be here this morning with all of you. It's an incredible room full of people. I see a lot of familiar faces, very bipartisan group, very deep expertise, so it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'll talk a little bit about the IDB and kind of where I fit in on this process, and then maybe color a little bit outside the lines for fun for a second. But just to clarify, I'm the U.S. rep to the IDB. I represent the U.S. vote in the IDB. I am not the IDB. I don't run programs. I don't control money. I don't direct loans. That is IDB management's role. We are there to express our voice and vote of the U.S. policy with respect to the bank. In the second panel, you're going to have one of the best experts within the IDB, Juan Ricardo here, and some of his team are here. You're going to hear from them specifically on the program. So I'll focus a little bit on how the U.S. sees the role of the IDB in an issue like this. And I think the short story there is very positively. And I think I'm incredibly bullish with respect to the role of the IDB, because here is a group that has a long attention span, a tremendous depth of talent and expertise, objectivity, independence, and a strong connection to the governments in the region, and then resources to back it up, right? Marcela was modest. AID is doing fantastic work, and I had the pleasure of working with them, and they know more than they admit they know with respect to what works on development and what works in crime prevention. They've done some tremendous analysis and rigorous look at how investments in crime prevention pay off. And I'll make another point about sort of the monitoring and evaluation in a minute. But AID does great work, and when it's combined with scaling up on the side of governments, and the IDB can help with that, that's where we start to see the long-term attention span that I think we all crave. I've been in government a long time. I'm coming near to the end of my government service. I see and have seen many times how good the U.S. government is at responding to a immediate need, the number of people that can fill a room to engage very thoughtfully on solving a problem. The challenge comes when we need to sustain that over a long period of time, and being able to put everyone's respective day jobs aside to focus on something for Ambassador Michaels might say decades or years. I'm talking about weeks or months if we're lucky. So we need to figure out how we build in a longer-term view and a longer-term commitment. And my view is that the IDB plays a critical role in that effort, so I think it's incredibly useful. What they're doing now essentially is serving as a secretariat function, helping to coordinate, and I have someone on my staff, Linda Dami, who's in the back of the room, and she spends her whole day working with IDB staff and then working with the U.S. government to coordinate what exactly is going on between those two entities and make sure that we're lockstep so that all our money's as best aligned as possible and that we're building on what each other are doing. So I think that is a useful role, and that is one that I think we will continue. With respect to the sort of broader challenge here, obviously there was an election that took place in the United States. There may be some anxiety in the room. I admit to losing a couple nights' sleep with respect to the uncertainty moving forward. But we have a room full of bipartisan stakeholders in this effort, and this is an issue working on the Americas that is more bipartisan than any other that I worked on in foreign policy, because I think at the root there is an agreement and an understanding that these are things within our interests, and that there will be political framing on either side at any given moment, maybe to accentuate or exaggerate some of the differences, but I think at the end of the day, there is more agreement than there is disagreement. And there's a temptation now, and I think this is sort of my coloring outside the lines, that worries me. As a representative of the U.S. in a multilateral organization, I've learned over the last couple of years within the IDB the importance of tone and tenor with respect to U.S. engagement in Latin America, and the relative ease with which, if we frame things in a particular way, use a particular language, and approach problems with the kind of introspective expertise that Senator Kaine just displayed with respect to his acknowledgement of the U.S. connection for the violence, the partial culpability in the U.S. role with respect to the problems in the region. Former Secretary Clinton was very clear and I think very loud with respect to the U.S. role in the challenges that are in Latin America. That whole approach, I think, is very, very helpful to working in the region. So I think there have been times where the President-elect and his staff need a little help to draw a logical line between some of the campaign rhetoric and some of what the policies are going to be moving forward. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, and that's not good for anyone. But with respect to the need to get to clarity, I think it's in all of our interests to help that rhetorical line be clear moving forward. And I think we all will, and we will get to a point where we can preserve some of the dynamic that we've worked hard for over the last decade. Falling into our old battle stations with respect to the U.S.-Latin America divide, I think there's going to be pressure on both sides for us to do that. And we know that fight, but it's a very old and tired one. And so I think we're all going to have to work to keep that in abeyance. The last point I will make is respect to working with the three countries. I think the patience for small ball has diminished, and I think there's a need to work with the three countries as a region together, with the private sector coming to the table with constructive contributions rather than complaints. And I think they've made a lot of progress there, but there's a lot more to be done. Taxes, obviously, is a sensitive issue. Private sector wants to know that their taxes are being used wisely. The government wants to increase taxes to have more resources to spend. That's a dialogue that can and should happen, but needs to happen with some speed and with some conclusion and some clarity at the end. The last piece I will make on in a lot of fora like this, and sometimes when we talk about U.S. investments and we talk about development investments, there's an introspection that the development community often brings, which is to say, we need to think about what each dollar means in terms of development impact and how each kid is served and how we're safer as a result of this or how they're better off. And so we look at all kinds of metrics. That's a great effort. We should look at that. We should spend a lot of time and energy and science into delving into that. But we should also understand that that this is a complex science and that we're not always going to have the answer. And I don't mean to forgive ourselves for programs that don't work. I think we should be very hard on ourselves for programs that don't work. We should know it and we should move on. But at the same time, and I'll make a comparison with our Department of Defense and security spending, I would put any day $1 million of defense spending alongside $1 million of development spending. And I think the development spending is going to have more metrics, more outcomes, more accountability than the defense spending to show its value. I've never heard someone have a general in front of Congress say, tell me how many widgets of security this $1 million in your $540 billion budget benefited for the United States. Show me results, show me metrics. It doesn't happen because they know that security investments are important. They know that this is a way to make America secure. That's all right. I just want to see the same confidence and conviction with respect to investments in development that we see in investments in defense and diplomacy. So that's my hope for how we all come together in the next administration to drill this home. I think there will be more consistency. There is a commitment. There are people in this room that will be working for the next administration, myself included. As it turns out, I'm a term appointee, and I will be extending over into the next administration for some period of time, and I will be in conversations with them. So we will all be part of the solution on this, and with that attitude, I am a lot less anxious about the future and a lot more hopeful about our joint ability to make progress in Central America. So thank you very much.
Let's see. Can I get through here? Okay, thank you very much. The last word, what's left to say? I'll start, though, by commending Christina Perkins and Aaron Neeler on this study, Achieving Growth and Security in the Northern Triangle of Central America. I want to commend Dan Rundy, too, for putting them to work on it, but I especially want to commend the authors of the report. They've presented in a very thoughtful way the complexities that underlie this swelling northward flow of undocumented migration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to the southern border of the United States. And they've shown how this human crisis is a dramatic consequence of conditions that exist in a common way among the nations in the Northern Triangle. These underlying conditions involve a lack of opportunity in still unequal societies. They involve physical danger from gangs and other violence. They involve too few jobs that pay too little, and especially in a formal economy, with so much of the economy still in the informal area that doesn't pay taxes and isn't regulated. Inadequate investment in human capital and economic infrastructure. Limited capacity of public institutions to manage public finances. We talk about tax reform and tax administration. You have to be able to do it. Limited capacity to provide services and to control corruption. And shortages of resilience to achieve and sustain a virtuous circle of increased effectiveness in governance, improved security, better opportunities, and public confidence in the future of their countries. And you put all of that together, and you have migration. This complex array of obstacles to the formation of more stable, just, and prosperous societies in the Northern Triangle is a challenge of sustainable development. And reading the report reminded me that these are not new challenges. And so I even as I read through this report and I saw things that sparked my memory, and I got out the report of the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America from January of 1984, which I had something to do with, and it was on my shelf handy, so I got it out. And I found a lot in there that is relevant. I mean, you start with the fact that it was bipartisan. That is relevant today. And beyond that, this group of eminent individuals who had, by the way, also bipartisan congressional senior advisors from both the House and the Senate, was chaired by Henry Kissinger, who knows something about diplomacy and international relations. And at an earlier crisis, they reached a consensus on some fundamental points that still resonate. They anticipated that local actors would shape the policies and the programs to address political and security and economic and social dimensions of the crisis. And they said you can't deal with any one piece of this, you have to deal with all those parts. To provide democracy, promote democracy, to renew economic growth, to improve living conditions, to achieve better distribution of income and wealth, to encourage personal initiative, to encourage investment, to mobilize domestic resources. We talk about mobilizing domestic resources as if that's a new idea. It's in there. curb corruption. In this context, this bipartisan group recommended that the U.S. provide $8 billion in economic assistance for the region for a period of 5 years, for a 1985 to 1989 down payment, not a one-year appropriation, a 5-year, multi-year appropriation of $8 billion. Well, Congress didn't do that. No surprise, I suppose. But they also recommended embodying that aid within an extensive web of educational and cultural exchanges, enhanced commercial and civil society relationships, and security cooperation over an extended period. And the 5-year recommendation was as a down payment, recognizing that this was going to take a long time. It had a long history, and they went into that history at some length in their report. A couple of things about their conclusions. First of all, it's striking to me how consistent their understanding was with what we think about now as being the nature of development, that it's complex, that it's multidimensional, that it's not linear, that it's iterative, and that it's achieved through experimentation and observation and learning, that it's inherently long-term with each country's path determined by history and culture, by the quality of its leadership, by the public and private institutions that exist, and the outcomes of political contests in the country. This is pretty sophisticated analysis. Second, the Commission emphasized that effective international support needed to embrace a broad range of political, economic, social, and cultural relationships based on shared interests. It needed to be politically astute and recognize that the Central Americans had the primary responsibility for their own development. Now, that's sort of conventional wisdom today, but it's a wisdom that is sometimes accepted more in theory than in practice. And I want to commend USAID because they've just adopted a new program cycle guidance that is based on collaborative learning and adaptive approaches to development. And I think the Northern Triangle may provide a high visibility opportunity to demonstrate the wisdom of that approach. I also think it's important to acknowledge that this set of problems that I mentioned and that others have referred to is not the whole story, that these countries have made considerable progress. If you look at the Human Development Index published by the United Nations, you'll see that they've moved up several grades from 4 to 6, in the scale. And in addition to these numerical indicators, we've seen the evolution of civil society and private sector institutions that's really noteworthy. And we have representatives of some of these institutions will be on the second panel, from COHEP, Fundesa, and Fusaris. And external support has certainly contributed, but the progress has not kept pace with the current challenges. Now, here we are, where the lessons of experience and a current learning are telling us that we need to bring together a broad range of instruments in a sustained approach. We need to work through multilateral as well as bilateral channels. Mark mentioned the role of the IDB, which is very important. Security and development assistance, diplomatic engagement, policy dialogue, educational and cultural exchange, commercial, professional, civil society relationships are all a part of what is needed. And a coherent structure of international support should look at innovation opportunities. The report by CSIS makes reference to the augmentation of local institutional capacity to combat corruption and impunity through CICIG in Guatemala and MAXI in Honduras. And one is supported by the UN, the other by the OAS, and they've brought highly respected criminal justice expertise into operational roles that do not undermine local sovereignty. They're working with the local institutions, but given a little augmented strength. An international presence might help to overcome resistance in other contexts. Possibilities might include assessments to identify obstacles The example of the mechanism for joint assessment in the U.S. El Salvador Partnership for Growth comes to mind. The CSIG and the MOXIE experience suggests that where you're working on politically sensitive issues, it's good to start by looking at doing this through multilateral rather than bilateral channels, because it's really important that the efforts are seen by local actors as having a local identity rather than being imposed from outside. I wonder if the effective internal support may be impeded by the simple volume and overlapping array of the current plans and strategies. And this is more a question than it is a conclusion. But I notice if you have a Central America Regional Security Initiative, it has 5 goals. I won't read these because it'll take too much time. The Alliance for Prosperity has 4 strategic aims, each of which has multiple lines of actions and strategic points. The U.S. Strategy for Engagement in Central America has 3 lines of action, each of which has a number of specific activities, and there's 20 of them if you add them up. The U.S. El Salvador Partnership for Growth has an agreed action plan to identify 2 identified constraints to growth with 20 goals. Then each of the countries has its own national development plan. El Salvador has a 5-year development plan with 11 objectives. Guatemala has a national development plan that has 4 major themes and specified 31 priorities. The strategic plan of government for Honduras has 4 basic themes and 15 intended results. Then in addition to these, which are all long-term, now you have to heed the demands for short-term progress set out in U.S. legislation. So you have a law that says that the Department of State must report to Congress that El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras governments are each taking effective steps covering 17 specific subjects, ranging from combating human trafficking to combating corruption to prosecuting human rights violators to reducing poverty to promoting economic growth to tax reform and to resolution of commercial disputes. And those are just some of them. Well, it's a lot, and it's all in the context of this current year's appropriation. So the certification, not to say you have to accomplish everything, but you have to address all of those issues and show progress. And there was a certification that went to Congress in August that moved the first tranche. And continued U.S. funding will require continued progress and additional certifications under this agenda. So if you're in Sahiplan in Guatemala or in the Secretaría Técnica in El Salvador or Honduras, what are your priorities? And my guess is that, among other things, you'd be very concerned about not losing that funding and seeing a deterioration in that important relationship that legislation represents. So I just worry about putting too much focus on 17 demands for short-term progress, keyed to a reporting cycle in U.S. law, and I fear that we might repeat the pattern of an externally dominated agenda that has disappointing progress and declining interest as the perception of an immediate threat diminishes. And people have mentioned, we don't have a PowerPoint here, but I have this, you can see at least in the front, that shows how U.S. assistance, this goes from 1946 to the present in constant dollars, and it's been an up and down all along. And what everybody has said here today is that what is needed is continuity of effort. So going forward, I'd like to see in the coming year, new administration, new Congress, let's take a look at this. Let's see if all these plans are consistent, that we have really a shared vision of where we're going. We have this wonderful institution that's been created of a high-level dialogue under the Alliance for Progress, and this is where the Inter-American Development Bank, as executive director, manages that. And let's be sure that we're focused on shared objectives and expectations and making a coherent effort that has a great chance for durable success. Now, I don't want to go through all the questions to be asked here, but just a couple are, what are the local priorities? How do the U.S. contributions respond to them? How well do the local priorities and the U.S. interests converge? Are the local actors and local systems fulfilling corresponding commitments that are necessary for the U.S. support to be effective? And are there adequate mechanisms in place to track the experience, to monitor the progress, evaluate the results, adapt to the changing situation, and provide for public outreach? Now, in conclusion, I commend CSIS for having produced this timely report, and for the future, I recommend that we make sure we know that our efforts are coherent and coordinated, and that we take a good look at that as we move forward in what will be a necessarily long-term effort to see this promising beginning mature into real positive change for the people and the countries in Central America. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned at the outset, I think we could not have a better panel than this, so I think that was just demonstrated. I want to use my authority of the chair to ask the first questions here, and one of them is playing off a little bit what Senator Kaine mentioned in his remarks, and Ambassador Michael mentioned, I think Mark Lopez mentioned, Marcela touched on as well. And the question I have is the kind of the focus on implementation, and as you just mentioned, the short-term need to show progress while maintaining a long-term commitment. I wonder if you all could speak a little bit more towards sort of how the implementation is going, and if you see any kind of early wins and successes. Marcela, you mentioned a few at the outset. If we could dig in a little deeper on kind of how it's going so far, I think that would be useful. And I don't know, I will leave it open for whoever would like to jump in. We'll do a jump ball.
I'm happy to start it off, but there has been an incredible ramp up, right? And this is not easy to do with large organizations, but partly on creating just the capability to be able to do these programs, to have the oversight, to make sure we do the evaluation. So that's about capability and people on the field. And the agency has really prioritized the Northern Triangle. We've put like 60 people on the ground in the last couple months to do this. But there's been a ramp up from the last couple years of our programs have gone from 24 programs to 48 programs. And our evaluations are going to go from 7 evaluations that we had per year. There's going to be 16 next year. But all of that is based on as Mark was saying, like very rigorous analysis on what works and what doesn't. And some of the data is in. I talked a little bit about our programs with crime, and we had a rigorous evaluation on whether our community place-based strategy worked. And it showed with this Vanderbilt study that in the places that we had worked, homicides had gone down by 66%. And so we now get to expand those kind of programs. And more than, I guess, the specific numbers where we've shown, in improving yields on coffee production in Guatemala by 45% in the last couple of years, despite rust, right? Increasing, which programs with our SMEs are creating jobs. We've created like 15,000 jobs in certain programs. Is that it's also changing what the local governments are doing, because we've had that much tighter conversations through high-level dialogues and others, where they have also changed the way that they do policing, moving from the mano dura approach to a lot more of community policing. We started with the 24-hour courts in Guatemala to have access to justice for a much broader set of the population. We started with the first 2. Now the government is funding other 7. So we have examples of not just our programs working, but how they've incorporated into how the government supplies public services.
I can't speak to the specifics of the progress that has been made. I follow it as an interested citizen and talk to people, but I think that what Marcela says is absolutely right, that there are certainly indications of progress. What I would say is that when I talk about the difference between short-term and long-term, I don't mean to say that the short term is unimportant. I mean to say that it has to be viewed in context of a longer term effort, and that these short term advances really can be useful tools in building confidence and building momentum for that longer term effort. And I think that You can't just say, well, in the distant future we'll see progress, but for the next 10 years we won't. You have to have a continuity of effort, but you also have to have some results to show.
I guess I would just say, I would defer to those who are managing the programs directly to talk about the programmatic impact, but with respect to the political commitments, I was the chair of the Partnership for Growth group at AID when we implemented that in El Salvador, so I knew that process with El Salvador very, very closely. And then I've seen this piece of the Alliance for Prosperity with the three governments, which is sort of, Partnership for Growth times 3, harder, a lot more coordination. And it's just not easy to get that group of interests around one table with the United States, which is a giant wall of human beings from various different agencies that don't always agree, to get us all around one table to have a willingness to engage on all sides and frankly to check some of the narrow self-interests of which exist all around the table. I saw us make tremendous progress, and frankly that's what I think we need to sustain, and that means that the private sector from all three countries needs to work together in a way never before. The public sector needs to work in a way never before. I think sometimes there's incentives to actually put down your neighbor rather than to build them up, and we need to make sure that there's a context whereby it's better. We're all better off when all of us are doing a little bit better. And to me, the political dynamic and the political commitment, which requires the U.S. to be there and to be some confidence that the U.S. will be there in a few months at least, if not years, that is a precious dynamic that we need to preserve. I think we created that. I think it exists now, and I think that we need to reassure the players in that space that will continue. And I think with that, we will continue to have opportunities for programs that work. But of course, no matter how successful AID can be in a particular area, we're not going to get the numbers to have an impact in macroeconomic growth and macro stability in the country unless there's a counterpart effort on the side of the government to scale those up and or just to solve the root causes that are there. So important learning, great achievements, and nowhere near enough when we're trying to reach our ultimate goal.
Thank you. One quick question that I think goes to something you just said. Also, I think it's at the heart of Dan's program here at CSIS on prosperity and development, which is one thing we haven't gone really into today is in addition to the U.S. government, the multilateral organizations, how do you all, from your positions, view the role of the private sector?
I can say historically that one of the areas that was showing some promise in the 1990s when I was sitting in the office suite that Marcella occupies now and that Mark did for a while later on, was that we had more dialogue between governments and private sector in the region beginning, and I think that has evolved and gotten better. And that there is now, I think, a greater recognition that, if you want better infrastructure, there have to be tax resources to pay. If you want to have people who can perform demanding jobs, you have to have an education system. And the government-private sector dialogue, I think, has advanced. That's certainly my impression in all of these countries.
To add to that, I think the private sector is the engine for growth for all of these countries, right? And a lot of the programming that we do, a lot of the what governments do is to create the enabling environment for the private sector to thrive and to create the jobs and be competitive. And what we see in the region has been stagnant growth, right? And creating the conditions for that dialogue, which is going to lead to faster customs, for lower energy costs, for reducing trade barriers. All those things are going to, in the end, help the private sector. But there's nothing like the private sector to really deal with the issues of poverty and an opportunity which we're looking at.
I guess I would just add that sometimes we sometimes it sounds like we're asking for the private sector to engage in a way that's more charitable and sort of out of their good hearts. And I think that's a misunderstanding, and I hope we're not asking in that way, because we should be looking at the private sector for the mechanical aspects of how the private sector engages rather than the humanitarian commitment on their behalf. And I think it gets confusing because there are some private business leaders in Central America who care very, very deeply about the future of their country, and they spend their own private money and personal capital and political commitment, and they fly up here to help advance this when they're not getting paid to do so. So I think we sometimes get a little spoiled. Oh, you did that, you did that, you did that. Like, why don't we ask you for a little more? And at some point, if I were in the private sector, I'd be like, hold on a second. I'm a business person, and at some point, you need to level with me on those terms. When I worked at USAID, I loved asking the private sector for money, not because I liked asking for money, which I did, and I liked getting it, which was even better, but because their sort of impatience with respect to results and outcome, and their sort of, trying to think of a curse word here. Their impatience with things that don't work was more fast acting, and I think that level of intolerance is really important when you combine it with government in any context, and you get sort of people bugging you like, where's that, where's that, where's that? It just creates a little bit of dynamic and puts us all a little bit on our toes. I think that's a very useful thing to inject. And then there are other business leaders who are perfectly fine with how things are because they're just totally able to cover their own needs and their own needs of their family, and they're going to go through the motions to, and this is private sector in general throughout the Americas, including in this country, go through their own needs to do whatever it is that it looks like that they're doing to be helpful. But at the end of the day, they're not going to help us help them pay more taxes. So there's the role of the government to actually step up, be systematic, make sure that the tax structure is fair across the board. A lot of times it's enforcement and implementation rather than just the code. And so there's a lot of dynamics there at play. And I think if we're asking the private sector to do more than is in their private interests, that's a recipe for long-term failure.
Aside from paying taxes.
Aside from paying taxes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'll do one final question before opening it up. I think one of the things that's interesting in the report is the report references Vice President Biden, who said that we need a Plan Colombia for the Northern Triangle. And one of the things, if you look back at Plan Colombia, and there's always been debate about this in Washington and I think outside, the balance between the more security-oriented aspects of the plan versus the more development aspects of Plan Colombia, and you've seen that evolving over time. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how you see the mix in this plan and how those elements are working together.
Okay, I can start, but I was just in an event yesterday talking about Plan Colombia and how it started as a very heavily security-focused endeavor, and that now, it's going to be a development challenge if, 27,000 ex-combatants are going to lay down their arms and need economic opportunities. I think the dynamic in Central America is similar and different. I think the approach of doing it all at the same time makes a lot of sense because, many of the people in this room who have been there and understood the choices that people are making when they decide to join a gang or emigrate, it have to do with the economic opportunities, and you're not going to have a thriving private sector if the institutions are not there and the rule of law is not there. So it's a messy mixture, and of course we could say if things were, if there was no crimes, things would be better, but we've got to work at them all at the same time because they definitely feed on each other.
I lean a little bit toward thinking that each country has its own history, has its own institutions, has its own issues. And the region of Central America, I think, has a distinct set of issues that are different. And that you can look to Colombia for example.
That is happening is some collaboration between Colombia and Central America, that the that we're all facilitating. The IDB is facilitating, AID is
Yes.
facilitating. That kind of, let Central brought in Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and others to participate in offering whatever expertise exists. And AID has some programs over the years whereby they'll pay the airfare and hotel for government leaders around the region, whether it's Chilean tax experts to go to Paraguay or Chilean phytosanitary experts to go to Central America. That to me is a very low cost sort of triangular cooperation thing where they can learn best from each other and take it from there. So I think that's a useful element.
Okay, thanks. And I think at this point we can open it up to questions. I would remind everyone to please identify themselves and please phrase your question in the form of a question. And there are microphones, so those will be coming to you in the back, behind you. The microphone's off. I think the question was essentially what AID and the multilaterals are doing on kind of to help or to work with the Mexicans on the issues that they're facing as migrants transit and then need to be removed from Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I could start, but it's a complicated issue because we haven't seen the numbers at this level and the dynamic that you're explaining, and that has led to us as USAID entering into areas that we weren't usually in. So in each of these three countries, we have and partner with IOM to create these repatriation centers where people are welcome to a dignified re-entry to their countries, and trying to work with the governments to find ways to use this population and tie them with opportunities for jobs and employment and whatnot. Because still a lot of the people who are leaving are the most entrepreneurial, the youth, people that these countries don't want to lose. So we are now helping with this repatriation and trying to link them with some of the programs that we do we currently have in each of these countries.
And from the IDB side, it's not an area that is a typical AID capacity building area. I'm sorry, IDB. Obviously, IDB is a client. The client is the government, so it depends on requests for assistance in that area. To my knowledge, there is not any engagement right now on that narrow area. And then if there were requests from the government, the IDB would do what they could. Obviously, they know a lot about institutional capacity, but this one's a lot more specialized.
In the back?
Hi, my name is Martin Anderson. I'm a decorated national security whistleblower. And my question goes to the whole issue of the rule of law and human rights in Central America. Before he retired, Senator Carl Levin sent to the Inspector General of the Defense Department a request to investigate the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies of U.S. Southern Command. One of the reasons for that was the participation of senior members at CHDS in active participation in the coup in Honduras in 2009. I'm all for giving as much aid to Central America as possible, but what happens when the United States itself does not have clean hands when it tries to apply these kind of things to Central America? Thank you.
Anyone?
Don't know anything about
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar
Delegation.
with the issue. I think it's a good question for the governments of the region as well. Like if you know, that they may have a view on that. But with respect to, you know, the IDB's engagement, there's no.
I have brochures if anyone is interested in finding out the real story behind it. I won the Federal Service's highest award at the Department of Justice. I'm now doing it at the Department of Defense. Okay,
Thank you. Yeah, let's take it offline. Thank you. Thank you. No question?
Hi, thank you everyone for sharing your time today. My name is Michael Fox. I'm a recent graduate of Georgetown University. My question pertains to a general idea of inclusivity in both governance and economic institutions and how vital that is towards perpetuating the virtuous cycles in development in the region. Thank you.
So yeah, we definitely believe that first, in every program that we do, we think about inclusion in terms of vulnerable populations and those that regularly are not part of the economic system. I think also at AID, we're trying to think more broadly around how we think about inclusive growth, and which is an issue that is important in this country, it's important in developing countries. And even in my work before AID at Harvard, we were doing a lot of research about this. And part of there's many ways to tackle this issue, right? When you think about creating a growth process that is more inclusive, is partly redistribution, right? That's part of the equations. Why we have taxes, it's how to create progressive taxes. But there's another angle that I think can be more action-oriented, which relates to how the process of growth ends up being relatively exclusive, in that growth happens in places that have aggregation of capabilities, right? Where you have the ports, where you have the graduate students, where you have the know-how, the infrastructure. So a lot of geographical areas just end up being excluded from the process of growth because of this dynamic. So programs and initiatives that are able to get the poor and those isolated to participate in networks that make them more productive, right? Networks that can be physical, like roads and water and electricity, which we think about, but also networks that are more virtual, like access to financial resources, and you know, the mobile phone has allowed us to lower the transaction cost to be able to create that inclusivity, and even, you know, social inclusion. So thinking about how we identify people who are excluded in this process of growth and actively include them is part of how we're thinking about our programs, and how we should be thinking about this broader question, you know, here and elsewhere.
I'll just echo the same, I think, disposition exists within the IDB, and Marcela said it better than I could, so I'll just say ditto to what she just said.
Well, in terms of the stability of these countries and their societies and the ability for them to sustain growth, if you have people who are not a part of that, then they're not contributing, and maybe worse, they're feeling disillusioned, and they're either fleeing or entering into antisocial behavior. It's just an essential part of effective development that you have an effort to bring people in, to offer them the conditions that they need to succeed and prosper and be safe, and to contribute to the society. And I think that, as Marcela has said, that this is certainly the context in which a lot of the policy dialogue is taking place between the U.S. and the countries in the Northern Triangle.
Thank you. I think we have time probably for one more question. We have one more.
David Dobrowolski from Winrock International NGO. I guess I'm really struck by the fragmentation that Ambassador Michaels mentioned in the long-term plan. There's so many objectives. But at the end of the day, we are talking about, in a sense, local development and inclusive growth. And given the importance of bipartisan agreement on some of these issues, To what extent do you see the opportunities in rural to urban locations or peri-urban opportunities? I think you could make the argument that migration ultimately is rural to urban and then through Mexico to the U.S. To what extent do we invest in the young versus the current set of political leaders? In other words, think through the future generation and reaching people in the private sector as well as the future leaders of these countries to put together the policies that will enable inclusive growth. And then what is the unit of analysis of scale? What are we scaling up? Is it at the municipal level? Is it the district level? You know, where are we going to find some traction? If we're asking the governments to put in their own resources to scale something up, which ones of these seem to be more promising?
I don't know if that counts. That were like 3 questions for the record.
Pick one.
Look, on the issue, let me try to go through a couple of these. And on the issue of scale, I think it depends. I think development happens at the local level. And the more data that we have at the more micro level, at the municipal level, I think the more context-specific programs can be. Obviously, there are things that happen at the national level when we think of rule of law and just the institutions. But the more that they could be referenced and decentralized at the local level, the more you're able to do programs that are context-specific and develop each region, right? Within each region, you have worlds of difference in terms of productivity opportunities. And the more granular, the better. The other question was around, you know, the youth and new leaders in politics. I think that's something that we aspire for everywhere, there, here, everywhere. And I do think I'm optimistic with a new cadre of young business leaders that are rethinking their country and the old divisions and know that their investment and their role is one of, you know, not just their individual businesses, but that their futures are aligned with the future of their country. So I am optimistic, and I'm hoping many of those enter politics. And then the last question? Rural-urban. I mean, that's something that, you know, urbanization is part of the development process. Sometimes people idealize the sense of the little farm. No, some of these places, as I talked about with the difficulty of including and getting the infrastructure to these isolated places, development in many of them is going to involve urbanization, and I think that is okay, right? Guatemala is 50% rural. For the level of income, that's you know, less urbanized than it should be. The problem is that you go to Guatemala and everything is happening in Guatemala City. Even you go into these regions of these medium-sized cities, and there are no private entities because the infrastructure is not there, because the institutions are not there. And I think, and I know it's part of what the Guatemalan government has pursued of trying to bring more capacity in the state into these intermediate cities so that those can be thriving nucleuses of development that can absorb some of the rural populations that are not going to be able to provide the jobs that match the, you know, the growth in population in those areas.
Well done. I'll just fill in on the fragmentation question. But first I wanted to, maybe our last word, thank Dan and Christina. I mean, you guys have done a great job by engaging on this issue. I hope you continue to engage, stay involved. This kind of a dialogue and this kind of group and is very, very helpful. On the fragmentation, I actually disagree with Ambassador Michael and then agree with him. So first I'll disagree. The fragmentation, it looks worse than it sounds worse than it is. I think there's different things and there's documents and, you know, and I don't want to be dismissive of the sort of substance and nuance that goes into every one of those documents, but there are a lot of similarities, and I think downrange people know what we're talking about, and I think the governments know what they're doing when they look at a list of 10 and a list of 20. I think the important nexus to connect is not within the various U.S. government documents that might exist between interagencies, but the country strategies of the governments, where their commitments are, where their political commitments are to their populations, where their political incentives are with respect to having to deliver downrange. we need to make sure that this is a win for them in addition to a win for someone in a building inside the district on their metric sheet, as important as that may be. I think the political wins downrange. So when we can marry those two, I think we're doing the smartest bit of engagement. And then agreeing with Ambassador Michael, I mean, he mentioned, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the exchanges and the ability to kind of invest in people and in the next generation. You know, the number of times where you run into a minister who speaks perfect English with a Kentucky accent, and it's sort of super bizarre because he spent several years in that place with a family, and he's got 100 stories to tell you about how he ate, you know, some funny food, which sounds exactly like a Peace Corps volunteer explaining how they ate some funny food in their country 20 years ago. That stuff to me is super valuable, and it's super inexpensive. And any kind of investment we can continue to make, not just in, you know, early cultural exchanges, but AID had for years done a lot of work with, you know, promising high school students from low-income areas, but even going up the value chain and doctorate education, master's education, college education. But it's not necessarily the U.S. It can be anywhere. It can be across the region. Now, when you've got, you know, Chile and Colombia and Mexico with universities that are getting to be at a world-class level, any effort, and I think all of us in the U.S. have experienced this sort of movement around the country. We go to different things, we wear different hats. The way that enriches someone's ability to have perspective when they're back in their government and their ministry, and maybe their counterparts that haven't had a broad life experience see sort of one solution to a problem, they may see 5 or 10. And I think that kind of creative ability comes only from that firsthand exchange and broadening your worldview. So I think any effort we can for the U.S. government, but any and all the other governments, many governments in the region have committed their own money to send, to provide their own people opportunities elsewhere, not just the United States, but anywhere else. I think that's a very smart investment and a very wise one for them in the long term as well.
I won't disagree with Mark. I'll disagree with him on his last point. I'm reminded again of history where we used to have thousands of young people coming up here for relatively short-term practical training, teacher in-service training, bookkeeping, how to run a business, very practical things, sometimes in the health sector, and it affected thousands and thousands of people, and they had an alumni association back at home, and they would become community leaders. This was one level. And also I remember when we had programs that brought people from some of the Central American countries that had their universities weakened by conflict and polarization, sending students for graduate training to the University of Costa Rica. And I can remember when we had a program that produced 33 PhD economists using local universities in Latin America as well as universities in the United States. And those things, I think, are very important. And the problem is you can't measure in an impact evaluation what that produced in 5 years, because it isn't 20 years. It is a generational kind of a thing. But I did say, I think, that the educational and cultural exchange needs to be a part of the relationship, and it's not all aid. It's a matter of relationships in the private sector, in the think tanks, and so on, that contribute to shared understanding.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think you can join me in thanking our panelists, both for their time and for their hard work on this program. Thank you so much. I don't know about all of you, but I take away a very important lesson here about institutional memory, and I'm going to go back at home and see if I can pull anything off of my bookshelf from 1984. I'm not sure if I can, but that level of organization and institutional memory is critical in this process so that we're not repeating the errors of the past and we're maximizing the lessons of the past. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I would like to note we have a coffee break, and you'll have just about 10 minutes to have some coffee and then come back for our next panel. Thank you.
I'm Christina Perkins, former Associate Director of the project here at CSIS. Now a full-time MBA student, so I'm honored to be invited back today to moderate this discussion. I'm joined by May Hung, Executive Director of AmCham in Honduras, Juan Carlos Zapata, Executive Director of Fundesa, the Foundation for Development of Guatemala, Jose Angel Quiros, Executive Director of FUSADES, the Foundation for Social and Economic Development in El Salvador, and finally, Juan Ricardo Ortega, Fiscal and Municipal Development Specialist at the IDB. So we're here today, as you've heard this morning, like so many others in Washington, we were really impacted by the surge of child migrants that came across the border in the summer of 2014, the majority of whom came from just 3 countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. As you've heard already this morning, this series of events prompted action on the part of the U.S. government, and more importantly, prompted joint planning and action on the part of the 3 heads of state in the Northern Triangle, convened by the IDB in the form of the Plan for the Alliance for Prosperity. Today we do want to check in on the impact of the Alliance for Prosperity so far, but also have a discussion on the key governance-related challenges that may or may not be addressed throughout this process, and that above all are serving as impediments to increase job creation and opportunity in the private sector in these countries. There are so many different theories of change and chicken and egg problems in terms of how to promote private sector growth and formal employment in spite of insecurity. So we're lucky here to be joined by 3 great representatives from the region, as well as our rep from the IDB. So I'd like to start with May here, who will talk about her experience in Honduras.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone. We are really happy to participate, and we thank a lot of what the CSIS is doing in making this report that will give us a whole perspective of how the Northern Triangle is doing in an objective way. We do have challenges, as you may read in the report. We do have challenges with gangs. We have challenges in security. But we also have a good activities and things that have been done in order to promote the development and the economic development of the country. As AmCham, we promote the investment of American companies and also of Honduran companies in the U.S. and to become more active. And of course, security in commercial and trade are one of the topic issues we always address. The national private sector in Honduras is expecting great improvements in the next 5 years, and we have developed a plan together, the government and the private sector, called Plan 2020, where we try to develop in 6 areas in which we believe the country will develop, and of course, it will be established by local investment, but also with the support of indirect and external investment. Honduras has a great advantage. We have one of the biggest ports that can customize to the U.S. We have great competitive advantage, international market openness. We have low production costs. We have the whole Central American countries. We have a geographic location that's really hopeful, but we need to emphasize more in the work that we can do together, private and public sector, in order for the development of the country. We believe that all the institutions, and we really appreciate institutions like the IDB, USAID, that always support and try to make plans in order for us to develop, but we need constancy in this. We need it to be sustainable. We don't need it to change every time a government changes. We need to make it to be established. And the best way to do it is by private-public alliances. That's why it is important for the private sector to be included in all the discussions that they do whenever the institutions work with governments. In order for this to happen, it will bring us stability, because we will continue working on a plan that will keep and develop the country. As mentioned in the report, the Colombia plan was something done many years. It took decades for it to take time. So this is the best example, and that's why we have to do it. The plan also has to develop. The development of our countries has to include the private sector in the dialogues, but also the formalization process. What do we mean by formalization of the private sector? That we have to stop and fight what is smuggling, illicit trade. Because this way, the formal markets will increase, and the formal markets are the ones who are responsible and pay for taxes. Also, with this, with the formalization of markets and facilitation of trade, we will get more taxes. You know, there's a lot of taxation, and it's not that the private sector don't want to pay, but it's better if you broaden the base of the people who are paying taxes. So this will be good activities to be worked, and as we said, and the report well states, we need to work as a team. There are different activities that we can do together. There's a lot of programs that support gangs, but then we have to come to what is the root of why are these gangs, or why are these unaccompanied minors traveling outside our borders? It's because they don't have an opportunity. So we have to work in making opportunities in the countries. We have to work to create more jobs, and only with the work together of the private sector, the public sector, and also the ONGs is that we can do it. There's a big challenge sometimes when we work all together. We always want to impose what we want. But there has to be a way that we have to share what everybody believes to do it in order for the benefit of the country. And specifically for Honduras, we are 8 million Hondurans who live and love Honduras. And sometimes due to many unfortunate situations, we get punished for one or two things that happen in the country. Instead of looking at the small things that happen, we should focus on the things that provide more welfare to all of us. We're talking specifically about human rights. We're a country, and we have promoted, and I can say I'm an example of how women also are included in different participations in the economy or in leading places. And we also have a lot of diversity, and we promote everything that's inclusion. And sometimes for a situation that unfortunately happens, we get all punished, and they try to stop the support for the country. I think that it's not that way that we will help develop Honduras. If we need all these things to be eradicated, we also need them to support and to strengthen the good things that we are doing in order to make it happen. Then, for last, and one of the important things in the recommendations that we have in the report states, it is good and it's important that we keep a sustainability of all these actions. We have to develop competitiveness, and the best way for people to do it is to have jobs and to be included in every decision. Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you again, CSI, for all this wonderful report.
Great, thank you. Juan Carlos.
Well, thank you, Christina, and thank you very much for everybody. First, I would like to thank the Guatemalan private sector that are here today, also the Guatemalan embassy. They have very important people working towards a common goal. I think that when we look at the challenges of Guatemala, and CSIS has been an important partner for Fundesa for the past 30 years, we've seen and worked together in different stages of our history. Fundesa being a foundation funded by the private sector as a counterpart for the World Economic Forum in Guatemala, we think that the opportunities that not only the new administration here in the U.S. has for the region, but also how can we look at productivity in terms of decentralizing investment in the region. And when we talk about Guatemala, as Marcela Escobari mentioned in the first panel, we only have 56% of the population living in urban areas. So we have one of the lowest urbanization rates in Latin America compared to 80% or 90% in countries like Chile or Argentina. So when we look at development, we have to start looking at how can we generate a process in which infrastructure has to be a focus for development programs for the next 10 to 20 years. In order to increase urbanization, mobility, we need to have the capacity for people to get from one place of the country to another without spending all his or her time just to do something that has to do with on how to open a business. And those are the key issues that I think can actually support productivity for Guatemala. When we look at the numbers of what has happened in terms of the electric sector, for example, we see that in the past 20 years, we as Guatemalans have been able to increase the capacity and the capabilities of the electric grid to reach almost 90% of the population when we had 40% only 20 years ago of people that had electricity. So we still have a 10% that in many regions has to do with small villages spread all over the rural areas. And that's going to be very important to keep 4 cents if you're in the spot market. So I think those are the real goals that we have. We have right now about 1,800 megawatts of energy that we can actually export to the rest of the region, Honduras, El Salvador. If you're looking for energy, you have to go to Guatemala because we have a lot of energy there. And it's now how we can export it to these countries. So we have to use CIEPAC. We have to modernize the different lines in order to reach that. Because at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you something. We've been coming to Washington for the past 5 years. I see a lot of friends here, staffers from both the Senate and the Congress. You have very intelligent people there working in think tanks, in different organizations. But one of the key issues is we were here on July 2014, and you put on CNN and all the different news channels. All they were talking about was the migration problems and the unaccompanied minors. And I just thought, well, that's what has been happening for the past 10 years. I mean, migrants coming to the U.S., it's the challenges of how we can actually support job opportunities on the ground that is going to lower that. Like that has been happening in other countries like Peru or Ecuador or even Mexico, that you see that you don't have many people coming in now because they have a job market. But the reality is that in Guatemala, when we look at productivity, you see that minimum wage, for example, is 3 times the minimum wage of Mexico. But that doesn't mean we're 3 times more as more productive than Mexico. It's just that in some areas, minimum wage is very high, but in the rest of the country, it's just an informality. So minimum wage is not even paid. So when you have 70% of the economic population in informality, and you have these dispersed productivity, when a person in Guatemala City is 10 times more productive than somebody in the highlands, that's where the development has to go. But you have to understand that we have national policies. We still do not have regional policies that can actually pertain more competitiveness at the local level. So we in Fundesa have been started to develop a local competitiveness index based on the recommendations of Dr. Ricardo Hausmann, where Marcelo Escobar used to work at the University of Harvard, in order to take competitiveness to the municipal level and start working with the mayors, with the governors, and seeing what you have here in the U.S. Because, and this is just something to think about in the future and with the new administration here, I see a lot of very capable staffers, both at the House, at the Senate. Why not do a program for staffers with the Congress of our 3 countries? That would really help to understand the political dialogue that you have here in the U.S. Just in Guatemala, we have 15 political parties. So it's very weak institutions. You don't really have a dialogue based on knowledge, based on facts. So I think the data that the think tanks here in Washington, D.C., and we, of course, in Fundesa use it very often in order to talk to our Congress to move forward many of the laws that have to go through in order to reduce the cost of doing business. In Guatemala, it takes you about 19 days to open a business. And that's just one of the realities that we have to work on. And of course, there's the tax issue. But when we look at taxes, you have to talk about personal income tax. In Guatemala, the highest bracket for a person is 7% of their total pay. So of course, it's very few. So what tends to happen is that politicians go and they seek the corporation because it's an easier target. But at the end of the day, we have to take some unpopular measures in order for everybody as individuals to pay more taxes, to increase the tax burden, which in the case of Guatemala is around 10% of GDP. And I think that that's one of the main issues. If we use that incentive to actually invest in infrastructure, I think that's going to focus on the challenges that we have to reduce chronic malnutrition in order to increase education, and for the state to have the capacity to go to these areas where now you don't really have the state of Guatemala present. And that's why we have so many drug trafficking going through Guatemala in many of these regions. And in most cases, some of these drug traffickers use NGOs in order for them to spike attention in other places and for them to just keep on with their business. So I think that in terms of how can we actually grow the investment that we have, Guatemala only invests 13.4% of GDP in gross domestic investment. And the public sector is just 1.3%, where countries like Panama are investing 43% of GDP in terms of gross domestic investment. So those are the key issues in order to have more infrastructure and mobility. If you come to Guatemala, if you use Facebook, use the hashtag, perhaps you need a little Guatemala. You're going to see the best pictures of the country. And for the holidays, we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you. Great, thank you so much. Jose Angel.
Should we all cry now? Thank you for your patience in sharing our thoughts. I'm going to read a document that I prepared for this meeting for two reasons. Because I was given only 15 minutes, and I don't want to go over those 15 minutes. And secondly, because I don't want to let behind any of the ideas that I want to share with you from the think tank's perspective. Okay, that's what I was asked to do. Therefore, I want to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for this opportunity, and thank you for your time. As painful as it sounds, there are 13 Salvadorians dying every day. That adds up to more than 400 homicides a month. Even though has been reduced lately, but those numbers are not good for anybody. We have become one of the most dangerous countries in the world, like in the region is like that. It's almost 10 times, those numbers are 10 times larger than the rest of Central America. Yeah. So just keep that in mind. Citizens of our region would obviously like to stay at home with their loved ones. They're not doing that because we're not giving them the opportunities to do so. I think that this initiative, it's a platform that can provide guidance and help to change that reality. So if we want to have a region in peace, growth, and hope, we should act now. And this is part of what we're doing right now. This morning, I'm here to talk to you about 3 Ds, D as in David. One is data, dialogue. The second is dialogue. The third one is durability of public policy. To me, those are 3 essential, and I will talk to you about them right now. They're an essential part of the equation to make these changes a reality. In terms of data, the findings of this book that you all have, I'm not going to refer to it because we basically agree on the findings that this study has provided us. So I'm going to give you more a national perspective in terms of what it is actually happening in the country, because we have been hearing from the other panel, in theory, what needs to be done and what it's needed. In reality, things are different. And that's what I want to share with you. One of the conclusions that this study has is that the cycle, that we can break the cycle of poverty and violence through a comprehensive assistance and security strategy that targets the push factors for migration and creates domestic opportunities to encourage Central Americans to build a future in Central America. Perfect. I should only add, and I mentioned that this morning, is that we should be more reliable on data to help be more effective in policy implementation processes. For more than 30 years, FUSADES, the institution I represent, has been involved in investigating and making up-to-date proposals for public policy in economic, social, legal, and political areas. In the past, we have worked and presented to incoming governments 5-year development plans to serve as a guide in order to implement those policies. Many of them have been put into place, many have not, so it varies according to the government that it's going into power, and we measure that over time. FUSADES is a leading think tank and has played an important role together with other civil society organizations in providing a platform of information that can help regional governments in their decision-making processes and improve the effectiveness of public policy implementation. Let me share with you 3 examples of how that data can modify perceptions that the government has. First, a recent study confirmed that extortions and gangs are a serious problem for competitiveness and job creation, especially in the small enterprises. It also proved wrong the official version that said that extortions were being coordinated mostly from jails. A law was created to combat that, and from the study, the information, scientific information we gather, that should be changed and refocused to get better results. Secondly, regarding crime prevention and juvenile violence, FUSADES did a study to determine why some youth are participating and others are not in gangs. If they come from the same environment, same families, so it was curious to see that. Providing data about critical risk and protection factors and programs in a local situation will help policymakers target problems more effectively. This study gathered enough information to assert through the evidence on the importance of acting urgently at the early stages to be more effective in prevention. And thirdly, another example that has to do with the Northern Triangle, the World Bank in Honduras hired FUSADES to coordinate a victimization survey affecting local companies. It is the first effort of this nature in the region. The idea of the World Bank is to carry out this pilot project in Honduras and then use the same methodology for the rest of the region, hopefully to give that input to governments. Given the lack of information in areas of prevention and crime and violence, FUSADES, through the Center of Investigation and Statistics, has become a reference of truthful information. The importance of having quality information is fundamental piece for the design of public policy and programs based on scientific evidence. The problem of violence is complex, and it involves all sectors, public, private, communities, local, youth, adults, etc. The studies carried out by FUSADES have highlighted the importance of articulating efforts in order to make them sustainable. Otherwise, they run out pretty fast. However, and given all this information, our challenge now becomes on how to make that data available to the decision makers and make them use it so that so that they're more effective. And that brings me up to my second D, which has to do with dialogue. In our country, we have become very rusty and at constructing dialogue. We need to change that because we have lost the ability to separate or classify areas of disagreement and generalize that if we disagree in one thing, we must disagree in everything, just because ideologically speaking, we think differently. That doesn't add to what we want to change. A great concern becomes the feeling that there is an electoral political agenda behind dialogue, more than the search for a long-term solution to such critical problems. Thus, if we can agree that political polarization does not add to true long-term national solutions to work on the most urgent constraints to development, it is imperative that a political understanding among all parties is reached on setting a common ground on what is needed to achieve growth and prosperity for all. Think tanks like FUSADES and the ones represented here should focus on trying to contribute to reach such an understanding. As a matter of fact, FUSADES, just to give you some examples, is already participating in national efforts to promote sustainable growth in what we were talking about this morning. The first one is the National Security Committee. As we produced this, I'm part of it, we produced this El Salvador Seguro, which is a comprehensive plan for making sure that all areas of crime and violence are considered, and results are yet to be seen. There has been 2 years now in implementing this plan, and although the writing in the plan sounds very good, and if you can read it, you can copy-paste it to any country in the world that has these problems, but results are not there, and that's a challenge that we must deal with. Secondly, we're part of the board of directors of MCC funding for aid. We're under the second compact already being implemented, and it's a platform to promote public-private partnerships, for example. And we strongly believe that the private sector has an important role to play in the growth strategy that needs to be done to compensate for crime. And thirdly, we're part of the Northern Triangle Consulting Group with the help of IDB, and have pointed out the need to focus on results, transparency, and building together a national development vision that can strengthen democracy as a means for a better living. That is not happening as of this moment. The Northern Triangle Initiative sets a platform to work together as a region, but there has to be a clear commitment from countries in the region to create confidence among sectors, especially the private ones, in order to invest. Investment is not going to come if confidence is not there. El Salvador has a unique opportunity, and the region, as a matter of fact, it is receiving cooperation, in the case of El Salvador, from U.S. government through Partnership for Growth, MCC, aid programs, and Alliance for Prosperity. They all have a space for public and private dialogue, but specific results are not there yet. In our view, this and other similar efforts have one thing in common. Bear with me. The lack of implementation capacity and a truly transparent strategy so that everyone understands what is being achieved and how. That is not in place yet. Although dialogue is important, equally important is that consensus reached reflects a long-term view and sustainability. And that brings me up to my third D, which is durability of public policies. At FUSADES, we're convinced that reducing violence in the long term can only be achieved if the economy grows, accompanied by a better distribution of wealth. Growth will generate new job opportunities, increase income tax to fund social programs, and thus reduce the need to migrate to other countries. Growth, given the conditions in the region, need to focus on reducing fraud and corruption by strengthening our transparency and accountability system, creating a better business climate for investment through a strong rule of law and solid institutions, and lastly, having a regional vision with Honduras and Guatemala to identify common challenges and actively act upon them. 2 years ago, we outlined the initiatives all the initiatives promoted by the Salvadorian government to address violence and insecurity all the way from 2003 to 2013. It was discovered that results and impact were very limited because of lack of continuity in the implementation of recommendations and no coordination among institutions in charge was set in place. It also pointed out that reporting methods were inconsistent, limiting effectiveness of policy actions to combat crime. This is a condition that probably explains why El Salvador is ranked one of the most violent countries in the world. This is why we strongly recommend that participation of civil society, academia, and private sector is vital to guarantee continuity in public policy. Likewise, donors and international cooperation have an important role to play in the successful implementation of the Northern Triangle Initiative. Country ownership should be guaranteed, manifested through measurable transparency and accountability indicators, also making sure that the right leadership is in charge of conducting the different activities being supported. I've shared with you many ideas, and that's why I wanted to read it, because there are so many scattered ones, but wanted to make sure that I didn't leave any behind. I finish by saying that we firmly believe that these hard times will become opportunities. We see them as opportunities. We want to be part of solving the problems, not being part of the problem. So the more we work responsibly in working together with other members of society, the results ought to be more rewarding and should make us think that the victory has been attained at the end. Thank you for your attention.
So one of the biggest challenges here is trying to put together a regional strategy with 3 extremely distinct countries, each with their own challenges and opportunities. So now we'll turn to Juan Ricardo Ortega, who will give us more perspective on the IDB's role in convening these 3 countries and really bringing consistency to this strategy, because you'll always have political uncertainty at the national level, but the IDB has consistent leadership at least for the next 4 years, and that's an important role.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, CSIS, for giving us the opportunity to bring this discussion forward. It is incredibly important and useful for people in the United States to understand the level of the achievement that has been reached in the region and the challenges they face and the need for the continuity of the effort. There is a process of building trust, not just among the 3 countries, which have done an incredible effort, but between the 3 countries and the United States. And it is a cooperation that is going to be absolutely key if you want to face all the security challenges that the region faces, and particularly for the U.S. southern border. So this is a very unique time in which what the countries have done, which is remarkable in many ways, is understood, but it's understood as well, not just on its successes, but on its fragility. And all my 3 partners have clearly mentioned that there is an urgent need for economic growth. If there is not a revamp of the institutionality and a building of trust for people to begin investing at reasonable rates, you are not going to see jobs generation taking place in the region, you are not going to see economic growth, and you are going to see probably a weakening of the political support for all the reform efforts that are taking place. So we are at a crossroad. They've done a lot of things so far. If you look what the attorney generals in the 3 countries have achieved, the police reform in Honduras that have rid the police forces from the drug dealers being corrupting some of the top officials. If you look at what corruption has been fought in Guatemala, and what Salvador has been doing during the last months with the Attorney General shows that you have very brave and committed public servants doing the right things in all three countries. But you are not seeing the economic growth. You are not seeing the large investment the region needs. You are not seeing the infrastructure, and you are not seeing either the education and health resources that are needed to give people opportunities. So this has to be a long-term effort in which you need to build institutions in a broader sense. And being a Colombian, I feel obliged to mention a little bit Plan Colombia, not for its success, which is on the media nowadays that the peace agreement has been finally reached. It's because of its biggest failing. And it was an excessive effort in security that didn't realize that just doing security in areas where there are no institutions can at the end up corrupting the security institutions and creating organized crime, void spaces that end up actually becoming huge challenges for the near future. And you are going to see in Colombia that's going to be one of the biggest problems in the coming years. How are you going to be dealing with all those parts of the country where there is not an even development of the institutions, where there is not presence of the rule of law, of the Attorney General's office, and other set of entities that are not just the use of force. And that's the one thing where the US and the Northern Triangle countries, in my mind, have gotten a much better approach, understanding that an independent and strong judiciary, being able to bring other institutions with the cooperation of the private sector, are as important as the security apparatus. That is where most of the emphasis is put in place because of the preeminence of the homicide rates as one of the main leading indicators of how things are doing. I would just like to emphasize that in these three countries, being able to have a more ample view of what needs to be done, and there is the dialogue and the cooperation for the development of long-term policies, are going to be instrumental for the success of one key partner for the United States in the southern frontier. If these three countries are successful, as I'm pretty sure they will be, it will happen because the United States stood by them for the next 5 to 10 years, but because you have the people with the will and the commitment to get things done. There are one key challenge in the near future. You have to get growth picking up. And for that, you will need a very creative approach in which the private sector and the public sector face this challenge together and try to come up with ways by which they clearly deploy enough resources to make these economies moving. If that is not the case, we're going to see a lot of the efforts probably faltering and not reaching the desired goals that all these presidents have set themselves. The IDB, on its part, is the main partner for financing of these three governments. We have $1.3 billion portfolio. Our emphasis are on the softer areas of development: education, health, institution building, and infrastructure. The security apparatus is mostly a US-backed effort, and we are working very closely with the private sector, hoping that we can come up with ways by which building parallel entities that have the executing capabilities that are able to begin deploying resources in the ground, hopefully getting things done, which is going to be probably the most important thing for the near term. That's kind of like what we're doing, and we're pretty hopeful because we have the right people on the other side of the table.
Great, thank you. I'd like to hear from each of you in terms of how you see this public-private cooperation playing out so far, and where you think the low-hanging fruit is in terms of where this can be happening more, and also what opportunities are being missed in the current process.
We have in Honduras, we have a good communication with the public-private allies. We work a lot with the institutions and with international institutions that support. I think that the private sector is really working all of us together. We, under the umbrella, as AmCham, and under the umbrella of the Honduran Business Council, COEP, we work together and we have a counterpart for the government. But sometimes maybe the institutions, they just go and look up for the government and they don't include the private sector or maybe they just do it when they have to socialize a new policy or a new rule or a new institution. I think it is important to take in consideration since the beginning, and it also can include think tanks, ONGs, community, civil society. That's an important participant in our communities, and as a whole, try to do it all together. I think the conversations and the dialogues are better than the situation, the political crisis that we had in Honduras in 2009, but we still have challenges to go. Right now in transparency, and as well as Guatemala did, we have the MASI. That's the new institution that the OAS has established for the communication and to seek for transparency and fight corruption in our governments. So we are taking steps. This is not something easy and something you do from one day to another, but it just takes some time. There's the will, but as I said, we need it to be sustainable. In order for things to really change, we cannot just do it in a 4-year term period. We have to keep on doing it, even though the people rotate, even though the people are changing, but we know there's a bigger stability in the private sector and sometimes in the ONGs than you have in the government. So we really need to start working at it, and we have a good support, and we appreciate the help that we get from outside Honduras, but there's also has to be a commitment within the country of the Hondurans to work for the Hondurans, and that's why we are trying to do.
So in terms of low-hanging fruits, I would say that it's important to recognize where we were in the past. When we look at Guatemala in 2009, we had 46 homicides per 100,000 people. This number has been going down to 27 per 100,000 people. Colombia has 25. So clearly we are in the right path because we have worked together as a society with NGOs, the government, international organizations, and of course the private sector to work together and to support the areas in which we understand that we have to move forward in terms of independence for our judiciary system, in terms of how to collaborate more with CSIC. That has been a tremendous help for our system because at the end of the day, before, what tended to happen was that very high politicians or corrupt officials, they thought that they were above the law. So we did need support for international organizations to start binding together and work on a better society. And that has had the commitment from the private sector and other NGOs that we've been working together with indigenous communities. Since the past 5 years, the private sector has invested almost $17 million to support think tanks like Fundesa, a school of government, to prepare more people to go into public policy issues in terms of how to address these areas. Start working together with people here in Washington, D.C. and lobby with the Congress and Senate to work together in these issues. And we have to start working. We have here very intelligent people like Lizardo, who's studying his doctorate degree now here. That's very important. He used to be within CIEN, which is a think tank in Guatemala. Now he's here in Washington learning about public policy issues. That's very important for a country like Guatemala because we need to attract. And then he will go back to Guatemala and implement all these policies that we need for the country. Now, there are, of course, a lot of issues that are still not moving forward, and we have to address them. In terms of chronic malnutrition, Guatemala is an outlier. We have 46% of children under the age of 5 that suffer stunting. That's an important challenge that the country has, and the government has been working together with other organizations like Scaling Up Nutrition, trying to focus on how to implement the 1,000-day window of opportunity program. But also we have to bear in mind that we have 50% of our population is indigenous. We have 23 different ethnics and different languages from the Mayan culture. So you have to go through the cultural background that you have to operate in order for these low-hanging fruits to actually have results. The other factor is how can Guatemala achieve a better education system? We have a lot of millennials. Guatemala increases its population by 2.5% each year. So we are still a very young population, and we will be young until the year 2050. So we have to work together in order to generate more opportunities. And it's going to be more cost effective for all US taxpayers to support programs that generate jobs rather than trying to stop them at the border. You will not be able to stop them. Guatemalans, we are entrepreneurs, and we will want something, we will reach our goal. So it's very easy, and if we work together as societies to generate opportunities on the ground, we have to go to the highlands. But when I see people from IDB and the World Bank and USAID, they just go to Guatemala City 3 days and then they fly back. They don't go to the highlands. They don't go to see where jobs are being created by the business sector. Go visit the companies. Go to the cement company. Go to a hydroelectric plant in a village in San Pedro Carcha where you don't see a police officer in more than 200 miles around. So it's very important to actually look at the challenges, because at the end of the day, we've been moving forward. But I think that it's an opportunity for a country like the United States to look at Central America. I was looking at some pictures of the US in 1920. There was a lot of poverty here in the 1920s. So we have to see what did the US do in order to achieve prosperity in those years. There's a lot of investment that has to be done in Guatemala towards infrastructure. The government has just launched an urban agenda. And in Guatemala, of course, we're the Mecca for the Mayan culture, so we think ahead 20 years. So we're working towards integrating an urban agenda for the next 20 years, but there has to be investment. So we need more investors, people, engineers, economists. Don't send us more people that are just activists and that don't look at the numbers. Send us engineers, send us economists, the people that can actually discover where the challenges are. How can we do a tunnel? Because we have a lot of highlands. We're not a flat country. We have a lot of mountains. We have a lot of volcanoes. So we have to do tunnels in order to actually, it's like Switzerland. You have to do highways that go through the mountains. And we need engineers to actually solve those issues. Because and this is just a personal comment, most of the time when I come here and I visit USAID, I see these brilliant people, but then I go back to USAID in Guatemala, and I just see social people, but they don't look at the numbers, they don't look at the data like Jose was saying. So I think it's very important to have more data-based driven policies. And looking at those numbers to find solutions together in order to achieve those goals.
Wow. I'm gonna, not gonna repeat things that have been said, but I wanna focus on the word that it's trust. You know, it's so important because, just to give you a context of what I'm want to say, we're coming from a government, in the former government, that the president decided that he would fire all of the private sector representatives from all the different board of directors of all of the companies that the government had to do with. So we're coming from that scenario. Nowadays, the present government is trying to rebuild that. The problem is, how do you rebuild it? You have to create trust with the things you do. If you want to create the environment around a truthful, sincere dialogue, you have to build trust. And trust only comes if results are there, if you see that the effort that you're putting up to any of these initiatives that we participate in are being result-oriented. Otherwise, you get tired because, see, the frequency that the government, or any government, I'm not talking only governments in the region, I'm talking governments in general, bureaucracy. You've been part of the government. I've been part of the government. We've all been in the mentality that things move differently than in the private sector. So getting a match between those and making both sectors understand that there is an alter reason why you do things, that there is there are other problems, bigger problems than not just being able to talk to each other. Then you start, but then trust comes from measurable results that you can explain to people, complying with what you said. There has been so many examples, I'm not going to go into them, but so many examples that the government says one thing and then comes up publicly saying a different thing than what was being talked in a table, in a dialogue between government and private sector. So it's very hard to build on that trust, but that's something that we should be focusing on if we want to get results. In the case of El Salvador, that it's a communist leftist government, the mentality is different. And that trust is even more important because the private sector doesn't see, naturally speaking, doesn't see government actions as being truthful and sincere because they do something and they say something else. So it's very difficult. It's different than the other Honduras and Guatemala, but what affects us affects Guatemala and affects Honduras. So it's either we see ourselves as a region or we're not going to create the impact that it's necessary to rebuild hope and peace in the region.
Absolutely. All right, and one more question before we open it up for audience Q&A. I'd like to hear from each of you in terms of particular areas in which you're optimistic in terms of economic growth in the region and in each respective country, and what metrics you think that donors and potential private sector partners should be looking toward in the coming years that demonstrate commitment both on the part of the national governments and the private sector.
I think in Honduras, recently, we can say like 2 weeks ago, the president decided to facilitate trade. And he intervened and created a new commission for facilitation of trade and customs. And it has allowed approximately 700, it took like 7 to 14 days in order to get a product or a container to enter the country, and now it takes just hours. So definitely this maximizes and promotes the commercialization of things, products, services, materials, anything, goods and that come in from import and export. And this will provide jobs. It is important, and I think, to visualize how important the formalization is. With formalization, we can get new ways of getting new jobs, not just the old ones, but creating new jobs. We allow the small and medium entrepreneurs to participate in the formal sector, so we get the data. We were talking about data. We need that data. In order to get that data, you need to have the statistics of the informal market, or from the small and medium entrepreneurs that they don't want to participate, or they just do things underside, not because they want to, but because the system, it's so hard for them to do it. There's also the challenge of education and technical skills. We have, as we said, millennials and new populations. I think I'm still a millennial, but I hope I'm still am. And then we have all these challenges of preparing people in new technical skills and innovations in electronics and all the IT systems that are gathered globally. It is something that in the last report of the OECD, they stated everybody is working on technology and innovation. And in the region specifically, we have a big challenge, but even we still have people that cannot write and read, even if it has lower years from year, but we still need to move more in that way. So training people. Another challenge that we may face is like in Honduras, for example, we have 63% of the households are run by women. So this means that we need to empower and make more participation of women in the market labor, formally, not informally, formally. Because that way, she's the household. She's the one who makes sure the kids have food and they get education. If the woman doesn't get educated, she won't teach their kids to be educated. And that's why we have all this unaccompanied minors traveling, or even violence activities taking place because they don't know and they're not educated well enough. And there's a challenge also that we do have. It's like, unfortunately, in Honduras, we have the highest level of, the highest data of girls under 16 being mothers. So, and preventing all this, it's because, so whenever they get pregnant, they stop studying, they don't attend schools, they just dedicate to work, and sometimes that's when we promote also violence. So are all these little things that we have to keep on supporting and put an emphasis. We have to look in the roots of the people of what, getting education, getting women in power, getting children and the young entrepreneurs and millennials participating and working in things can make a difference, helping the people being individually more capable of being introduced in the economy. That would definitely be of a great help.
So I would say that Guatemala has to take advantage of some key results that have happened in some sectors. For example, in the telecommunications industry and the electricity market. Those are key issues in order to achieve more competitiveness for the future in terms of how to increase technical training towards technology, for example. I would like to see more programs on how to learn English in rural areas. We need more people in Quetzaltenango, close to the highlands, that can actually speak English, to work at call centers. The call centers and the BPO industry has a large demand in Guatemala to actually increase because a lot of the people don't want to work with India anymore because of the time zone difference. So it's very easy to work with Guatemala when you have the same time zone. So as you see, we don't really have an accent, so we really, when we really want to learn English, we do. So the other part is, how can we move to an orange economy based on technology? We've been increasing now, as Colombia has done, on how to do movies in our country. We just had one called Ishkanul. You can all see it, and please do, because it shows you how the rural areas in Guatemala operate. But now the movie cluster is really starting to focus on how to operate, because at the end of the day, we have one of the most beautiful settings in the world. And the other part is, how can we reform our National Statistics Institute? We have to work together with the Statistics Bureau of the U.S. or other institutions that focus on how to train statisticians to actually look at numbers and work on population. We are going to have our national survey next year, national census. The national census next year. So we're actually going to see how much the population really is, because it hasn't been done since 2002. So that's going to be very interesting for all the data. And also try to see on how reforms can actually benefit the low and less productive people that are right now in poverty to get more jobs. And I'm talking about hourly wages. If you didn't know, in Guatemala, it's illegal to pay by the hour, something that in the US is very normal. The other part that I just learned is that when we export coffee to Mexico, we pay high tariffs. So Mexico is importing coffee from Asia when we have a producer of coffee right next door, and we would be supplying the whole southern of Mexico with just enough market for us to make the highlands increase its productivity. But at the end of the day, I go into the IDB office, I go into USAID, and I look at coffee from Costa Rica, Colombia. I never see coffee from Guatemala. So we have to have more coffee, because at the end of the day, agriculture is a large employer. So we need to add more value. We understand that we have to invest more in technology to increase its value. And the other product is cardamom. I mean, at the end of the day, Guatemala is the largest exporter of cardamom in the world, but we need to add more value because these are sectors that employ a lot of people but are very low productive jobs. So we have to increase technical training towards those areas if we want to start supporting the industrialization of our country.
Okay. It's incredible that we need to be speaking about this because to me it's ridiculous that we cannot, as a country, get together, or as a region, get together and identify one single apuesta.
Bet.
Goal that we want to.
Project.
I see that happening, for example, and I'm not going to move to Asia or anything. Costa Rica, they decided to bet on tourism 35 years ago, and they haven't moved from that. We have the tendency that every 4 or 5 years when the government changes, they go and say, put away everything that has been decided, I'm going to do my thing, and they change everything that happened. They change people, train people in the government and others. They change their mentality, their priorities, and everything. So it's like starting all over again. I remember talking to Secretary Minera many years ago. I was Minister of Transportation at that time, and he was also Minister of Transportation, almost, 20 years ago or something like that. I'm not that old. I asked him one question. He had only 5 minutes. I asked him a question and said, how do you keep up with the same policies over and over? And he said, the answer he gave me, I never forget that, is that he said, the only person that changes when the government changes, it's me as Secretary of Transportation. Everyone else is technical people, and they don't move. They stay here. So it's continuity. It's a key word in terms of whatever we decide, whatever we bet on, it's important that there is continuity. Otherwise, we lose a lot of the resources, a lot of the capacity, a lot of the energy that has been put into one initiative. So I would focus on that, and I would try to identify what the sectors are in the region that will set ourselves above and beyond and give us a competitive advantage over other regions. That's something that we lack at this point and that we should work on.
Great. Juan Ricardo.
If I may briefly, I'm optimistic. I think the region is going to be seeing its better years. And what is going to be happening in the U.S. actually, I think, is going to be helping. You're going to see a major investment happening here, most likely. And one could bet that the $4 trillion that they have mentioned, it is likely to occur. The need for infrastructure is evident. And the same is in the Northern Triangle. There is a clear need for infrastructure. And they have an enormous opportunity. We've been looking at projects that are there that could be developed, even many of them in a profitable way. You can see $8 billion of likely investments in the coming years. About 3.6 in energy and close to 5 billion in roads, ports, and airports. The airport's infrastructure clearly needs to be revamped. You can see the security challenges in La Aurora, and you can see the same in El Salvador. And these are hubs that are huge, that are key for everybody's logistics in the region. And the opportunity is right there. There is the lack of trust. There is the lack of the capabilities of people able to put together the procurement process and the execution of the projects. But that can be done. If you manage to build the partnership among the U.S., the 3 countries, and the public governments, I'm pretty confident they will achieve quite a successful and remarkable set of investments in the coming years.
All right, I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience. Right here.
Hi, thank you. This was very interesting. My name's Georgette Spanjic. I'm with ML Strategies. It was great today to hear a lot of conversation about the need for tax reform and the need to strengthen the capabilities of public institutions in the Northern Triangle when it comes to tax administration. And there are obviously quite a bit of challenges in this space. But one particular issue that doesn't get a lot of attention is that there are a number of both local and U.S. companies operating in all three countries that are overpaying in taxes. And this has resulted in significant tax refunds, value-added tax, income tax refunds owed to U.S. and local companies in these countries. This is a problem, as many of these companies have indicated, if this kind of continues to go on, that it'll affect their ability to sustain their business operations. And for the U.S. companies, Ambassadors Robinson, Maines, Nealon have been having some difficult conversations with the local governments about how to address these issues. But I was wondering if the panel could elaborate more broadly on what impact these outstanding tax refunds might be having on economic growth in the region and the desire of the Northern Triangle governments and the U.S. government and its multilateral partners in creating economic opportunity as a solution to the root cause of migration.
I think that in the case of Honduras specifically, maybe you're addressing the 1.5 value-added tax that has been taken in place, that it's not just only affecting the international multinational companies, but also the local, and especially the small companies. I think we have to look at it in the way of formalization of the informal market again. Sorry that I insist with this, but it is important to broaden the base of taxpayers in each country, more than putting more taxes to the people who pay. There's a myth or a rumor that private sector in our countries don't pay taxes and they don't like to pay taxes. Yeah, there's some cases that had happened, but that's not the general case. And we can bet that the private sector also produces and works in order to regulate this and collaborate with the government. In Honduras, we have had a recent increase, a significant increase on the collection of tax, so they have been put in order. But again, as I said, we need to move and promote formalization, because what you're doing whenever they tax more, they put more taxes, first, there's a lack of trust. And people don't like to pay taxes because they don't trust to whom they are paying the taxes for. That's the main reason that maybe sometimes somebody doesn't pay. Another thing, and that's something that happens in AmCham. Our companies, or the companies members of AmCham, they do pay taxes and they don't take risk in order to avoid paying taxes, because that's a high cost. They wouldn't go and try to avoid paying taxes in our countries when they can get affected globally. And there's also the challenge that when you have to think in the things that generate jobs. So if the formal market is generating the jobs, you have to still promote and invest and try to gain them and give competitiveness. Because what you get is like, okay, formal market is paying taxes, and then you get all the illicit trades of goods and products and illicit services that are working. And we can say that gangs and a lot of not informal entrepreneurs, but I say gangs and organizations and crime organizations are the ones who get benefit with this. Because sometimes it's not, and we were talking, and there's like, sometimes drug, it's not the most common product that they can commercialize and get profit. Now they can get it from the products that pay high taxes, and it is a cheaper and a better way to get money instead of drugs. So we need to focus that formalization is really important, and to support and to give incentives to the formal market. It is a way of developing the economy.
The more you pay tax, nobody wants to pay taxes
No,
anywhere in the world.
We don't.
Okay, that's a fact of life, But I'm not saying that you shouldn't pay. But I just want to give you one example. In the history of El Salvador, for example, 1989, taxes were reduced to 3 taxes. value-added tax, import tax, and income tax, okay? And the next month, the income for the government went up 30%. You know, we decided to move away from all these little taxes that needed more administration, more corruption between government officials to, you know. So that's an experience. But now, since then, there has been more and more going back to putting more and more taxes. The problem is not that, which is a problem. The other problem is that the more taxes you pay as a company, the more informal you want to be.
Yeah.
The more informal you want to be, the less taxes the government receives. And the more the companies that decide to keep on paying taxes, which is smaller every time, become less competitive.
And they move.
Every time you pay more taxes, you become more competitive within the country, with other informals that don't pay taxes, and with the rest of the region and the world. So the less competitive you become, it's harder to think about exports. It's harder to think about competing with other parts of the world. So it's a tricky question, but needs to be solved the way you said it.
If I may briefly, just to give you some hope, being a former tax administrator, I kind of like know what you're talking about. What is been happening is you are seeing major reforms of the tax administration. What have they done in Honduras is incredibly brave. They face very corrupt and even dangerous apparatus, and they totally revamped the full administration. They fired 100% of all tax administration and customs administration employees. And when we sat down with them and they were designing the strategy, many people told them that they were risking literally collapsing. And for a country to have their tax administration collapse is a pretty dangerous decision to be made. But they dared to do it. So what you are seeing is the process of trying to implement a new tax administration that doesn't have the systems, nor the trained people, nor the process and procedures to be able to give money back. It is painful, and I can clearly understand how frustrating it must be. But if they see it as a longer-term thing, they're going to have a much better partner if there is the commitment to continue the efforts that have been so far being carried out in Honduras. So I would see it as a hopeful message. And from the point of view of most people sitting here, having secure customs in Central America, believe me, it's strategic. It is something that could allow you to sleep in peace and to know that there are people watching a lot of entry points that are key for illicit criminal organizations that are transnational. And one last thing that I think is useful for you to keep in mind. Informality is not just about taxes being high or payroll taxes being high. There is a phenomenon in the region that makes it even more complicated. Is drug dealing needs huge shelters and structures to launder money. And that has a huge role in informality. They need networks of distribution of goods and services, and there is a big dimension of trade-based money laundering happening all throughout Latin America. And that is a huge challenge for the private sector and for the people that do pay taxes, because as you just mentioned, the competition is incredibly unfair. But as long as you have $20 billion that need to be laundered all throughout these countries, you are going to see a huge push for some structures to keep informality at the very high levels that you're seeing.
I would just like to add and congratulate IDB, because in Guatemala they've been working together with SAT, the tax administrating collection agency, in order to increase the capability of the people working in customs. Yesterday we were at the U.S. Treasury, and what we were talking about is how can we reform our commercial code, because it hasn't been reformed since the 1970s, in order to advance on how to generate more corporate governance within businesses in Guatemala that can actually generate more transparency. So I think in terms of organizations like OFAC that are working in the region, that is very important that we reform our commercial code as well.
Great. One more question. In the back, right behind you.
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade and Senior Associate with CSIS Americas Program. Congratulations to Dan and Christine for an excellent program. I cut my teeth in Central America in 1984. We had the Kissinger Commission, we had the Sanford Commission, which at least has an institution at Duke after it. And I'm optimistic because back then we were at war, and everything you guys were doing, we founded FUSADES, FIDE, Fundesa, people were getting killed because of that. But 2 points for food of thought, future on more work for CSIS. One, the missing actor in this, Mexico. How come nobody talks about Mexico as a regional player and its nefarious role in all kinds of trafficking and its responsibility as a regional player? And two, decentralization of public institutions. Most of our countries are still in the Spanish royal crown era of everything is in the main city. And, people have to come to Guatemala from Chichicastenango for a birth certificate, not to mention passports, registering businesses, and so on. The secret of liberal democratic capitalism is not capitalism. It's the liberal and the democratic part, which means you can live and run a business in Boise, Idaho, and you never have to come, thank God, to Washington, D.C. for anything. That's the secret. And at some point, that's what these countries need with that decentralization.
Just adding up to something that David just said, not only Mexico, I will also include Belize, especially for us as a Northern Triangle, because then you get a lot of free commercialization and transit of people, goods, and everything. Yeah, but
it had a lot of coast.
But the free zone is not that small.
Yeah.
No, but it can enter. That's a way to enter the region without being noticed.
No, but I think I completely agree with what you were saying, and the intermediate cities agenda that is happening in Guatemala right now is in that path precisely, on how to look at 9 points. We have to bear in mind that Guatemala has $70 billion in GDP. I mean, not even compared to El Salvador and Honduras, you still don't reach the GDP that Guatemala has. So we are a very large country and working together right now with the border of Mexico in order to actually compete and trying to get more products into the south of Mexico, which is having a great impact in most regions if we can actually work together, as you mentioned, in order to lower some tariffs for products that could actually be commercialized in the southern border of Mexico. But another challenge is, and this is just important because at the end of the day, when we talk about security, there is an issue of drug trafficking. Just 3 days ago, there was a seizure of $25 million on cocaine on the coast close to Belize that were caught by the Guatemalan Marine, of course with the support of Southcom. But at the end of the day, we need to get our armed forces to work together because when we have to protect the borders, protect the region, we need the U.S. Army working together with the Guatemalans and Honduras armed forces and of course El Salvador, but also Belize, because at the end of the day, they have a lot of coastline that for drug trafficking is very important.
Just briefly, with your question, it's just because we're thinking locally. If we were thinking to be competitive with a global set of mind frame in mind, that changes the whole structure of the things you need to do internally in order to refocus your strategy into a more competitive worldwide strategy. And that's not happening. I mean, we're fighting and see, we have border controls at a 20-foot container stays 3 days in the border between Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. 3 days. And they have vegetables in the back getting ruined. What type of mentality do we need to change that? We need to change bureaucracy. We need to change a few things. But we haven't decided where we want to go. And that's something lacking in the region.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. And since I forgot to do so at the beginning, thank you to Dan Rundy, who invited me back to speak today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.